The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. And straight into round one to test their vocabulary. 2 marks if you can give me the meaning of these words. Beginning with Nancy Spain. Nancy, what is Galantine?
It's dreadful, Jack. It's a sort of mixture, pounded down, of various complicated meat substances.
What kind of meat, though, Nancy? Get it a bit straighter.
Dead, I imagine.
What kind of meat?
Yes, please.
Well,
for instance, white or red, white or brown?
Oh, it's sort of pale pink. Pale pink rubberized.
Well, Nancy, considering your close relationship with Mrs. Beaton, I'm only going to give you 1.5 marks. Because it's always white meat, boned, spiced, rolled or tied, boiled and served cold. Usually chicken or veal. And now, Frank Muir, what is a Lamasery?
Oh, yes, well, it's quite easy, isn't it? Given time. Lamasery. 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 Is it French?
No. Oh, yes, it was. I'm so sorry. You're quite right. It was originally a French word, but it's not about anything French.
Feminine. Lamasery.
Tibet.
Lamasery. Tibet.
Tibet.
Yes, that's
With a lama, French for the woman.
Almost anything else but.
Is it is it either the furry animal or the priest?
It's not the furry animal.
Then it's the priest, and a lamasery is where he eats his food.
It's a monastery of lamas in Tibet and similar countries, too. Dilys Powell, what is miscibility? Miscibility. Miscibility.
Sounds like a character.
Capable of being mixed up, like me.
That's it. It's mixableness, having the ability or the disadvantage of being mixed up. Denis Norden. Denis, what is a cucking stool? C-U-C-K-I-N-G. A cucking stool.
Ah, yes, it's a shame that we don't do this anymore.
Folklore.
Yes, it's a bit folklore. When a medieval lady had behaved in such a way that she wasn't a lady, they used to sort of dunk her in a pond, putting her on this chair first so that, she should be seated, because they retained the element of courtesy while having this kind of physical vigour in those days. And so you were in the pond, which is... In modern days, we say up the creek, but in those days it was in the pond. It's a stool for putting ladies in ponds.
Isn't it actually
right.
Isn't it actually the origin of muddy evil?
I won't comment on Frank Muir's deplorable invention, but Denis Norden is quite right. It's a chair on a long sort of pole that you put disorderly women and sometimes dishonest tradesmen into, and then duck them in the horse pond or the village pond. Well, before we start round 2, I give each team a quotation, which they can write down if they want, and I want the 2 women members of the team to study their quotations, and at the end I shall ask them where those quotations come from. So, Nancy Spain with Denis Norden, here's your quotation. Revenge is a kind of wild justice. And Dilys Powell and Frank Muir, yours is I'm getting married in the morning. And then at the end of the programme, I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their idea of how these words came to be said or written, and I don't want any of these answers yet. Well, here's round 2, a nice, easy round. These are nursery land questions. 2 marks if you get them right. Nancy Spain, who had 3 bags of wool, and for whom were they intended?
Baba Black Sheep.
Yes?
Have you any wool? No, sir, no, sir. 3 bags full. 1 for the master, 1 for the dame, and 1 for the little boy who cries down the lane. So,
Why
3...
should he deny them and then enumerate them? Should
I
it's
often
yes,
wonder.
sir. Yes, sir. Isn't it?
I think it's sort of oriental.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, yes, sir. But that would be, have you any astrakhan?
You're quite right, Nancy. 2 marks for that. The alternative and rather more severe and disciplinary version is none for the little boy who cries down the lane, but that left 1 bag over, I suppose. 1 for the master, 1 for the dame, and 1 for the little boy who lives down the lane, in the lane, or down the lane, is the usual one. Frank Muir, what 3 sailors sailed off in a wooden shoe?
It's from a nursery rhyme, Jack.
Yes?
Goes, Maresy dotes and dozy dotes and little lambsy tivy, a kiddle eat ivy too, wooden shoe.
I don't think this was a mixed ship. I don't think they'd have been allowed.
Is it? I can see sailing through stars.
That's it, quite right.
Is there anything to do with Wee Willie Winky?
Yes, you're getting near it. Start with winking.
Oh, Winkin, Blinkin, and Nod.
Well done. With some
noddy.
assistance, you've crept home. Quite right. Winkin, Blinkin, and Nod. One night sailed off in a wooden shoe, sailed on a river of crystal light into a sea of dew. And unlike most of these nursery rhymes, we know who wrote it, a chap called Eugene Field. 2 marks. Dilys Powell, what materials were used by each of the 3 little pigs to build their houses?
You know, Jack, this programme always makes me feel I had a very deprived childhood.
Yes, but surely you saw the picture.
Depraved or prived?
I'm depraved on account I'm deprived.
I huffed and I puffed and I blew the...
House
That's it.
down.
Blew
Yes,
two of them
the
down.
blowing is the clue.
The last one was bricks.
Yes?
House on bricks.
Come on.
I can see the little tails.
You had a happy childhood, come on.
No, I went to the pictures. Obviously don't go.
Bricks, straw,
Yes?
right.
Straw. I got straw and bricks. I just want something else.
wood.
Yes, that'll do. 3 pigs built respectively in straw, and it was very easy to huff and puff and blow down. Then from sticks and twigs, which is the wood, and finally from bricks, and that couldn't be huffed or puffed down. 2 marks. Denis Norden, what are the lines that come after the following ones? Fee-Fi-Fo-Fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman.
I never knew. I had my head under the covers by that time and was twitching. Well, what is it?
Grind his bones to make my bread.
Yes, that's the last line. I think 1.5. It goes like this. Fee-Fi-Fo-Fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead,
Oh,
I'll
yeah.
grind his bones to make my bread. And it's in Jack and the Beanstalk. Next round is all about origins and derivations. And because the actual expressions are fairly easy, I'm going to give 3 marks for the best answer to the origin of the expression. I don't necessarily want its current meaning. Yours is the first, Nancy Spain. The expression is to rat.
Well, it means to scarper, or get out of the ship quickly while it's sinking.
And the origin?
It derives from the fact that when it was well known to the rats that a ship was going to sink, they slunk off down the hawsers, or cables, which were mooring the ship to the quay side. And they could be
Absolute-
actually seen before the ship sailed, strange though it may seem to you.
Absolutely right. Either the ship was sinking and they ran away very quickly indeed, or they could, or were supposed to leave a ship when it was in port because they sensed that its next trip was going to be the last one. 3 marks. Frank Muir, Dago.
Dago, Dago. Midnight comes and I want to go home. Dago, yes. Yes, it's an expression, Jack, which is used by chaps who aren't Latin American or Italian
Yes.
or Spanish for chaps who are
Yes.
Latin American, Italian or Spanish.
And it came from what?
Oh, it came from a feeling of anger. A feeling of keeping them out. It's a dago. Well, it's an anagram of goad, You see, and they're trying to goad them by using this sort of expression. It's Dago. It's actually because of their tanned complexion, the South Americans, they call them Dago, which is short for daguerreotype, which is a very early printing on silver when the features came out dark.
1.5 marks for inventiveness and sheer effrontery and complete lack of accuracy. It began, this expression, in Louisiana, because a man of Spanish parentage was popularly called Diego, which is the Spanish for a very common name, James, much as Irishmen are sometimes called Micks, and Welshmen are sometimes called Taffies, and Scotsmen are sometimes called Jocks. Same thing. All right, Dilys Powell. Catherine Wheel.
Well, it's kind of firework
Nowadays, yes.
nowadays. It has some relation to St. Catherine,
Yes.
being broken on a wheel.
Not broken.
Revolved,
Revolved.
Yes, it revolves, yes.
Revolved.
as indeed a Catherine wheel does for
Yes.
about 2 seconds, then it jams against the pin.
I think 2 out of 3. It got its name from St. Catherine, virgin of royal descent who came from Alexandria, and she confessed the Christian faith at a sacrifice which was being held by the emperor, and of course wasn't meant to lead to being Christian at all. She was put to death by torture, which was being gradually cut into small pieces by means of a sharpened wheel, rather like a chaff cutter. And the firework was named after her because the red sparks represent her blood as the wheel killed her. Denis Norden, Hussy or Hussy?
Well, it's one of those birds who used to get put in the pond. Hussy. Does it come from Hussif?
Yes.
That's a strange thing. When I went in the RAF, you had to sign for all your equipment. There was a thing down there called housewife. It was spelt housewife, and it was a little sort of brown bundle tied up with a white tape. And then when we had the first kit inspection, the sergeant said, "You've got to put your Asif on the bed." And I didn't realise I had one. It obviously comes from Hussif. It's a Hussif without an if. That's what a Hussy. Comes from Hussif.
You're quite right. It comes from housewife, and the odd thing is that it now means a worthless woman or a pert, ill-mannered young woman, and originally it meant a housewife who was presumably very respectable and honest and jolly
Well, there
nice.
you are. Times do change.
Well, these are French or Latin expressions which are in common use, or fairly common use, in English. 2 marks if you get them right, their meaning. Beginning with Nancy Spain. In Vino Veritas.
What do I have to do? Translate it?
Say what
No.
it means.
See how many words you can get out of those letters.
In wine, you speak the truth.
Yes?
Well, meaning when you're drunk, you tell everything.
Not you, Jack, particularly.
No, not you, no.
One.
Yes, one. Yes.
Thank you, Dennis. Drink tends to loosen your tongue so that you may betray secrets or show your true character. And 2 marks for that. Frank Muir. Sans culotte.
Should
Sans
be
culotte.
ashamed.
Or whichever you like.
Sans culotte means without trousers. Does.
And came from what?
A chap who sits at the foot of the guillotine and applauds when the heads drop. Rabble.
Yes.
One of a rabble.
One of the rebel.
The individual constituent of a rabble.
That's right. Contemptuous name given during the French Revolution to ragged-trousered and poverty-stricken people who, as Frank rightly said, were rather pleased when they saw aristocrats being guillotined. 2 marks. Dilys Powell, rather similar. Soi-disant.
So-called. So calling oneself, it means.
Yes, it doesn't say called.
Pretending to be, claiming to be.
Claiming to be. Yes.
Calling oneself to be.
Yes. I think that's good enough. It's self-styled, that's really what it means, or self-called, and it usually means pretending, the soi-disant viscount or vicomte. It means he probably wasn't, or you didn't, in fact, regard his title as being either true or important. Denis Norden, pis-aller.
Well, it means a second-best course. Not the course you would have chosen, but the course you've been obliged to choose from the French Allet, meaning to go, P, meaning worse.
Absolutely right. 2 marks, you get it. Something accepted for want of a better, of course, you would take because there's no better line of action at that moment you can take.
Sort of fate demure.
Yes, that too. Well, now we come to the last round and go back to those quotations which I gave the two teams earlier in the programme. For 2 marks, Nancy Spain, can you give me the origin of your quotation? Revenge is a kind of wild justice. And I'll give you the clue that it comes from somebody's essays.
Well, it's from an essay, I was going to say.
Good.
By Bacon.
Yes. Absolutely right. Essay of Revenge, Essays 4, by Francis Bacon. 2 marks it is. I gave you a little help because I think, Dilys, your quotation is really rather easy. I'm getting married in the morning.
It's one of the songs in My Fair Lady.
Sung by?
What's his, her pa, Mr. Doolittle.
Yes. And My Fair Lady by? Make it harder.
Lerner and Lowy.
Yes, that's quite right. And a bit of help from Bernard Shaw. 2 marks. And now I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their explanations of how these quotations really came into being. And on this occasion, the marks will go to whichever incredible explanation receives the larger and longer amount of applause from the audience here in the studio. So, back to Denis Norden with his quotation, revenge is a kind of wild justice.
I don't know whether you're like me. I get very perturbed about certain kinds of food. I don't mean physically, I mean mentally. They worry me. I ponder about them. Baked jam rolls. Does it worry you why the jam is always so very, very, very much hotter than the surrounding dough? You bite through the dough, that's fine, and then suddenly, like a trumpet blast, your mouth blares with molten lava, which stays hot. No matter how much you fan your mouth with your tie, or it stays hot all the way down. But the one food which has fretted me the most is blancmange. Now, for the benefit of our overseas listeners who may not have been exposed to this favourite English dessert, I should explain that blancmange is a kind of opaque jelly, generally in a pastel shade. It's made from gelatine mixed with milk, with all flavour banished. When you put a spoonful out onto the plate, it gloops. It has a wobble, but the wobble is completely sexless. Whereas with jelly, particularly lime jelly, that is positively sensual, but blancmange, never. And it has worried me as to why anybody ever took the trouble to invent blancmange. I can't believe that anybody set out to invent it. No man in the whole of recorded history could have been that dispirited. And so I made inquiries about it, and I found something very rich and strange. The word blancmange is Hungarian. In Hungary, the word blancmange means love. Now, isn't that fascinating? In Hungary, they would sing, I'm in the mood for blancmange. Or they would sing, blancmange me and leave me and let me be alone. Why? Why should the word blancmange be Hungarian for love? I probed further, and I came to what they call nowadays the crunch. You see, it was invented in Hungary, but it wasn't invented as a food. It was invented for Hungarian violinists to soak their bows in overnight. Now, you know, Hungarian violinists are very special. They play this passionate, wild czardas, and only a Hungarian violinist can achieve this marvellous, melting, sobbing tone, and only because they soak their bows in blancmange, you see. And you can see the etymology now. You see it's blancmange to violin bows to chardust, chardust to passion, passion to love. Therefore, blancmange becomes equated with love. It's a marvellously fulfilling thought to think that what is love in Budapest is blancmange in Huddersfield. And I must say, I have taken much comfort from this thought. And whenever I'm at a seaside boarding house and this pale, pastel-coloured mess is glooped onto my plate, I look at it and I think to myself, despite appearances, blancmange is a kind of wild chardust.
I'm awfully glad Denis has got that out of his system. It's going to help a lot. And so back to Frank Muir, and his quotation was, "I'm getting married in the morning."
One day, on my way to the theatre, something funny occurred to me. I got off the bus, thinking about it, walked through the streets, found myself in a narrow paved cul-de-sac with garages either side, and for a while I just stood there and mused. The thought which had occurred to me was that though there are many splendid books written about the origins of phrases, origins of lines of poetry, there were no books written about the origins of songs, of popular songs. This I would do. I resolved, there and then, to make this my work, my task, my labour. And I set about it. I worked at this, 3 years? 4 years. And then one day, it was a Tuesday, I remember, I went to a Chinese restaurant, and I had a Welsh rarebit. And I found I was sitting next to a Chinaman who was eating curry, an Indian curry. And I decided to make conversation with him, and I said, no likey Chinese noshi, amiably. And he said, no, not very much. He was an Englishman, actually. He'd sneezed into that little pot of curry powder they give you to dip your poppadom in. I made a mental note, actually, to check whether that wasn't the origin of a song. Actually, my poppadom told me when I was in Delhi. One has to chase all these things, you know. So I told him of my life's work, and I'd been working at this origin of popular songs for some 4 years, and I'd achieved success at last and had got one. So he said, well, what is it? So I said, well, it's the origin of I'm Getting Married in the Morning, you know, the song from My Fair Lady. He said, I know it well. I said, oh, yes, and he said, yes. And he said, what's the origin? I said, well, it's, you know, the willow pattern plate. Well, you know that chap who's kneeling by the little wooden bridge over the stream? Well, that's what he's singing. So he said, no, he isn't. I said, but it is, it's well known. I've checked it up. And if any listeners are eating their dinner now, and if either of them has got a willow pattern plate and is eating his dinner from, he can check the story. Now look, right. Now, there it is in front of you. Now shift the roast potato slightly to one side, and you'll see the chap kneeling, the bottom right-hand corner, by the wooden bridge, right? He's got a fish in his hand, right? And then, just up where the horseradish sauce is, just by the peas, if you scrape the gravy aside, you find a tall pagoda. Now, you see, in that pagoda, you can just see those two faces. Now, that is a mandarin, and his daughter, the girldarin, you see. And the girldarins always walks in that little wood. You see, she picks the riceberries, which they grow in China, or picks one of the ricet apples. And she is in love with this chap on the other side, kneeling by the bridge, who's a peasant. You see, he's just a coolie, but he's a bit of a poet, and he loves her. Now, he's a very poetic chap, you see, and he can't afford a gold wedding ring, because he's only a coolie. Now, you notice just above the top of the plate there, it should be bare, 2 doves. You see, now he's taken the little lead ring from the leg of one of those doves. He's fished in the stream for a goldfish, and what he's doing, while they're looking out the window, is he's rubbing the base metal against the goldfish to make it gold to put on his beloved's finger. And as he's doing it, he's singing very gently, I'm getting married in the morning. He said, no, it's all wrong. He said, it's red China now. It's all changed. They're communists. So I said, what do you mean? He said, they don't have mandarins now. He said, that tall pagoda is now a deep freeze for fish, where they make fish fingers for the whole of southern China. That little chap at the foot of the bridge is a coolie working. Of course, they've cleared out all the goldfish, because that's gold is a capitalist emblem, and they've filled it with red mullet, you see. And this coolie has got to fish 2,000 red mullet out of the stream, de-gut them, and have them ready for the deep freeze per hour. And that's what he's doing, you see. What he's got to do, he's got to jam the red mullet in a line in between the boards of the bridge, and that way he can slit 6 at a time. So I said, then what's he singing then? He can't be singing I'm getting married in the morning. No, he said, he's singing the communist-approved workers' work song. I said, what's that? He's singing, I'm gutting mullet in the boarding.
Well, your vote, Frank Muir, just wins that new version of the willow pattern plate. And that brings us to a final score in which Frank Muir and Dilys Powell win by 1.5 marks from Nancy Spain and Denis Norden. And it also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The program was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the program and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir, and Denis Norden. Here's round 1 to test their vocabulary. Possible 2 marks. I want you to tell me the meaning of the following words. Beginning with Dilys Powell. Dilys, what is a Gary? G-H-A-R-R-Y. Or it could be R-R-I, I think. Gary.
It's a movable object.
Yes, it is.
One can be moved in it.
Yes, you could, but that might mean almost anything. I mean,
It's a kind of carriage.
it's a kind of carriage.
There's a carriage.
In India.
Yes, absolutely right. It's an Indian carriage, usually drawn by a horse and usually plying for hire, a sort of horse cab, a hackney carriage, ticker gharry, usually. That's found in Kipling. 2 marks. Denis Norden, what is cryptesthesia? C-R-Y-P-T-A-E-S-T-H-E-S-I-A. Cryptesthesia.
Cryptesthesia. Crypt would be hidden.
Yes.
Esthesia, well, that's like in anesthesia. Who was the rightful heir to the throne of Russia? Played by Ingrid Bergman, was it?
I think 0.5 mark, Dennis. It means supernormal knowledge. It can be telepathy or clairvoyance or something of that sort. The knowledge of secret and supernormal things. 0.5 out of 2. Nancy Spain, what is a shako? S-H-A-K-O.
Oh, it's one of those hats with a peak at the front and a plume and a lot of brass.
And what shape?
What shape?
Head shape.
Like one of those buckets you take to the seaside.
Yes, absolutely right. It's a beautiful description, Nancy. You get 2 marks. It's a military hat, more or less cylindrical in shape, with a peak on the front and an upright plume or tuft. Crimean War sort of stuff. Frank Muir, what is a cuisse? C-U-I-S-S-E. Cuisse.
A cuisse? A cuisse is what runs down the front of one's trousers.
You're so nearly right.
It's also, though I hesitate to mention it in such young company, a French thigh.
All right, now let's put these two things very carefully together. There's a crease in front of your trousers and the thigh inside which you put it. Can you think of anything else that you might, in medieval times, wear on either your English or your French thigh?
Armour.
Yeah. Armour for...
Thigh armour.
That's it, you're absolutely... I'd give you 1.5, because I did help you to get there. It's thigh armour, and as Frank quite rightly says, it comes from the French for thigh or haunch. Well, before we start round 2, I give each team a quotation for them to write down. And I want the 2 women members of the team to go on studying their quotations. And then at the end of the programme, I ask them where the quotations come from. And to listen with Frank Muir, here's yours. I am a citizen of the world. And Nancy Spain with Denis Norden, your quotation, I don't want to play in your yard. And then at the end of the programme, I shall ask Frank and Denis to give me their idea of how these words came to be said or written. And I don't want any of these answers yet. So to round 2, which is a round of Greek mythology. 2 marks. I shall give you one name in a couple that are associated together, just as one might say David and Jonathan. I want you to give me the name of the second person who's linked in this particular association. If you know a bit more about the legend, I'll give you an extra mark. Dilys Powell, Philemon.
Baucis.
Baucis it is.
Baucis.
Baucis is willing.
Sorry, I got that first. And what about them?
Well, I think they were visited by some divine characters.
Yes.
And I think they were rewarded somehow.
That's right, yes, that's splendid, Dilys. You get your 3 marks. Philemon and Baucis were an ancient husband and wife and famed for true love, living in Phrygia in a poor cottage, and they entertained the king of the gods, Zeus, very hospitably. He'd been thrown out of every other surrounding house, so he drowned all the surrounding neighbourhood and householders, but he gave Philemon and Baucis whatever requests they wanted, and they asked that they might die together, and so it was. And Philemon became an oak, and Baucis a linden tree, and their branches intertwined at the top. Charming little story. 3 marks. Denis Norden, Daedalus.
Daedalus is the firm of Daedalus and Icarus,
Yes.
aircraft manufacturers. Daedalus designed the labyrinth for King Minos.
He did, yes.
And Icarus was his son, who flew, who made himself a sort of crude flying machine with wings, and like most of us, he essayed to fly too high.
Yes.
And his wax melted.
Yes.
And he fell in the sea, poor devil.
Unfortunately, Icarus flew because he was proud, too near the sun, and the sun melted the wax on his wings, and he fell miserably into what was afterwards called the Icarian Sea, between the Cyclades and Caria, and his father flew safely on, but mourning him. Nancy Spain, Orpheus.
Orpheus and Eurydice.
Yes?
Orpheus had a lute and made trees with it, rather surprising.
Made or
I always
played?
thought
Well,
that.
you know, Orpheus with his lute made trees. It goes on after that. And he soothed the savage breast, and he played so marvellously, a sort of previous pop singer. He would go down to hell or anywhere and whack away on this lute so marvellously that hell would open up and Cerberus would let him in. And he was able to do pretty well anything.
He was going after somebody in particular, though.
Eurydice
Yes.
was the one he was after.
Yes, I think you get your 3 marks. He went down because Eurydice, his wife, had died of snakebite, and he went down to charm Pluto and Persephone, the gods of the underworld, and try and get her back. And nearly did get her back, but he wasn't to look back and see if she was following. So it was he who tried to look back, and then she vanished in a blinding flash, and he never saw her again. Very sad. 3 marks. Frank Muir. Jason and
Chips? Is that a term of affection?
Yes.
Medea.
Quite right. And do you remember anything about him?
Do I? If it's at all connected with the golden fleece...
Yes, it was.
Ah, yes. Well, he met her while he was searching for the golden fleece.
He did.
And fell in love with her. And it's terribly complicated, Jack. All these Greek plots are terribly complicated. And I didn't want to bore you all. So I'd rather take my marks and really get on to the next round.
I'll give you 2.5.
reason.
Jason went off with the Argonauts and the good ship Argo to look for the Golden Fleece, and he fell in love, or rather, Medea fell in love with him, and she helped him through great dangers to get the Golden Fleece. He married her. Later on, he deserted her. He wanted to marry a girl called Creusa, and she became very tough indeed and killed both her sons and his sons, Jason's sons, and killed the girlfriend.
It's all rather Greek,
and
isn't it?
all like that. And then disappeared in a blinding flash, I think, and Jason is alleged either to have killed himself or he was falling asleep under the old ship Argo and the stern fell off and killed him. Sad story. 2.5 marks. Well, so to a round about origins and derivations, and I've got to try and mark it up to a maximum of 3. Dilys Powell, I want to know what this is now and how it originated. The phrase, a toast.
A toast?
A toast.
A toast? Well, it means now drinking health to somebody.
Mm-hmm. And comes from?
Comes from stale bread, usually. It used to float.
You're getting there.
Yes.
It used to float
They had
toast
toast, they had
on
toast
punch.
in the punch, yes.
Well done. Yes.
They had toast in the punch.
Yes, that's good enough. Well, 3 marks it is. A toast is a person or a cause or an object or something very odd indeed to which you're invited to drink, a compliment as well as the drink itself. And it comes from the piece of toast which used to be put into the tankard, and you still may find in loving cups at universities and other places. And while Charles II was on the throne, there was a certain Galantine who pledged or toasted a noted beauty in a glass of water which had been taken from her bath. And one of his companions said he didn't want the liquor, but he'd like the toast. Meaning the lady herself. 3. Denis Norden, to pass the buck.
Well, it means to avoid responsibility and claim the responsibility as somebody else's.
Yes?
The buck. I don't know.
It's an American phrase coming from the game of poker, and the buck was a piece of buckshot and was passed from one player to another as a reminder that the chap who got it was the next dealer in the next round. And nowadays it's the larger counter that you have among the other chips, and again it signifies the dealer passing the buck. 1.5. Nancy Spain, skylarking or skylarking about?
Well, it means kicking up your heels and making merry.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes from an old naval saying, all hands to dance the skylark. Or any more hands with the skylark.
And what did they do then, Nancy?
Well,
Steady.
because they had been at sea, seems incredible, it was true for so many days, it was obvious that this vast ship's company, as we used to have, did we not, Dennis, in our battleships, wooden walls, 400 of us together. We used to be dragged up from below, where we were lashed to the oars, and told to prance about on deck and let off our very high spirits.
Yes.
And this was known as skylarking.
Yes, that's near enough, Nancy. It does mean, of course, fooling around nowadays, engaging in boisterous horseplay, that sort of thing. But it was particularly the younger apprentices and sailors, and when they were told, and Nancy's quite right, all hands to dance and skylark, what they used mainly to do was to rush about all up the rigging, up the mast and up the rigging. And that was why it was called skylarking. I think it's a pun on the word. Skylark or lark in 2 ways. 3 marks. Frank Muir. Slewed. S-L-E-W-E-D. Slewed.
Means killed in battle. Probably a naval battle,
Yes?
because it's to slew round.
Yes, it is.
Is to turn sharply, so that you sort of crab round in the water.
And nowadays, colloquially,
Drunk.
drunk. Slewed is drunk nowadays, and it comes, 3 marks, it comes, as Frank quite rightly says, it's when a vessel turns or swings forcibly out of a forward position, it slews or slews round, changes tack, heels over, may stagger if it's not rightfully well looked after, and hence it comes to mean intoxicated. 3 marks. Well, next round is about literature and drama, 2 marks for good answers. Dilys Powell, I want 2 novels in the series which are called the Barsetshire novels and the name of their author.
Framley Parsonage.
Yes?
And what's the other one? Not the Warden.
Yes?
The Warden.
Yes.
Anthony Trollope.
Anthony Trollope, The Warden, Family Parsonage, Barchester Towers, Dr. Thorne, The Small House at Allington, etc. Denis Norden. There was a French dramatist who wrote plays about, first, a miser, second, a misanthropist or misanthrope, and third, an impostor or hypocrite. I want to know the names of those 3 characters and the author.
I want to know a lot for your rotten 2 marks.
I'll give you a bonus mark, because I think you are being asked rather more than the others.
Molière.
Yes?
Now, what were they? The miser
The miser.
was Labar, was Harpagon.
Yes, quite right.
What were the others?
Misanthrope.
I'll come back to that.
And the hypocrite and impostor.
That was Tartuffe.
Quite right. If you get the third, I'll give you a bonus mark.
For £20,000.
It's worth it.
Yes.
No, I can't remember this one.
All right, 2 anyway, Dennis. You've done very well. Molière, the miser was Harpagon, as he says. The hypocrite and impostor was Tartuffe. The misanthrope was Alceste.
Alceste, yeah.
2 marks. Nancy Spain, who were Codlin, Short, and Mrs. Jarley, in what book and by what author?
Codlin
Short and
Short.
Mrs. Jarley.
and Mrs. Jarley. Oh, is this Dickens?
Yes?
Probably Nicholas Nickleby.
No, it might have been useful to Icarus or Icarus, these.
Miss Flying.
No, Mrs. Jarley's.
Parachute.
Umbrella.
All right, one out.
Umbrella.
It's Charles Dickens's old curiosity shop. Codlin and Short were the Punch and Judy men. Codlin's the friend, not Short. And Mrs. Jarley was the keeper of the waxworks. Mrs. Jarley's waxworks. Anyway, Frank Muir. Who were the Tullivers, and in what novel, by what author? The Tullivers.
Oh, yes. This is from Tulliver's Gravel by Swaneth and Jift.
A splendid idea.
Swaneth and Jift wrote this as a satire, and they went to Pullylit. Am I right? Tulliver Whist by Dahl's Chickens.
I don't think you're going to get it.
Mill on the Floss, come on.
Come on.
Mill on the Floss?
Mill on the Floss.
Yes.
Mill on the Floss?
Mill on the Floss.
George Eliot, the well-known lady.
All right, yes, they are. Do you remember what their Christian names were?
No, I didn't remember their surnames. Maggie.
And Tom.
Tom. Oh, yes, well, I think with combined operations, you've got there.
Maggie.
And Tom.
Yes. Tom and Maggie Tulliver, the sons of Mr. Tulliver, who was the miller in George Eliot's novel, The Mill on the Floss. 2 marks. Now we come to the last round and go back to those 2 quotations I gave the teams earlier in the programme. First of all, for 2 marks, Dilys Powell, can you give me the origin of your quotation, I am a citizen of the world?
I'm a citizen of the world. He was an orator.
He lived in a tub.
Diogenes. Thank you.
Half a mark. Oh, wait a minute, this is 2 marks we give. No, yes, we get 1 out of 2. It was the philosopher Diogenes, who reasons best known to himself, lived in a tub, and when asked of what country are you, said, I am a citizen of the world, thus for the first time inventing the word cosmopolitan, which was quite clever of him. Nancy Spain, can I have the origin of your quotation, which was, I don't want to play in your yard?
It's a music hall song.
Yes?
I don't want to play in your yard. I don't love you anymore. Hanging round my cellar door.
That's it.
I don't know who wrote it, though.
All right. I don't want to play in your yard. I don't like you anymore, on in bits that they went on with. And it was written by Philip Wingate, who's an American songwriter, sung by Gus Edwards, music by a chap called Petrie. 1 out of 2. And now I shall ask Frank and Denis to give me their explanation of how these quotations came into being, and on this occasion the marks will go to whichever incredible explanation receives the longer amount of applause from the audience here in the studio. So back to Frank Muir, and your quotation, Frank, I am a citizen of the world.
When the wind is in the east and the mist is on the mountains, the Maoris in New Zealand gather round their cooking pots and they sing. They sing, killy, 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 watch, 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 kiyam, kama, killy, 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 watch, 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 kiyam, kama, ayo, ayama, ayama, poliwama, ayo, ayama. That is the first 17 and a half bars of the song the Maoris sing. Now, who is this Ayama that they celebrate in song? Well, I'll tell you. Ayama was a foundling white child, a baby who fell off the back of a carry-cot. The little baby fell into a bush, and it was brought up by the apes and the monkeys and the baboons and the chimpanzees. It grew up, alas! No, it grew up a boy. But it grew up, alas, a sickly child, and eventually the Maoris rescued it from the monkeys. The Maoris, of course, gave it a name. They tried to give it a name because it had been brought up by the monkeys. They called it, first of all, Chimpy Edwards, but it didn't suit it, you know, because it wasn't a big enough child. They called it Apey Herbert. But it wasn't really a nice enough child. So eventually they called it Ayama. Well, now, Ayama didn't really grow any stronger as he grew up. He lived in a tree hut on top of the tree, and he tried to beat his chest and go, oh! But he had an awfully narrow chest, and he tended to miss. He made do for a month or two by beating a friend's chest, but it wasn't the same. And she didn't like it very much. And then he tried swinging from the creepers, and he didn't have much luck with that. And one day, when he'd thudded to the ground extra heavy and fallen unconscious, when he woke up, he found a blonde stranger bending over to him. He said, "Me, Ayama." And the blonde stranger said, "Me, Jane." And Mr. Jane was a very kindly man. And seeing this poor, thin, white changeling, clad only in a dirty skin, and that his own, he wrapped him swiftly in some butter paper, put him in his haversack, and took him back to England. There the lad, Ayama, grew tall and stout and flat of feet. And aged 93, he eventually prospered and became chairman of the Ways and Means Committee of Egham Rural District Council. Rather a mundane ending, perhaps, to his life. But in New Zealand, among the Maori tribe, he is still a legend to them. They still sing of this weak boy brought up in the primitive jungle. What do they sing? They sing simply, "Ayama, Sidi's son of the wild."
Well, I can only say that New Zealand has acquired a much more extensive fauna than I thought it had. I wish it all the best of luck. And now, back to Denis Norden. And Denis, your quotation was, "I don't want to play in your yard."
have you noticed that wood is gradually disappearing from our daily life? The feeling now is that wood is vaguely corny and old-fashioned, and its place is being taken by plastic and metal and plaster and strange Swedish chemical compounds. Now, obviously, this worries and has worried the people who are concerned with manufacturing things of wood and selling wood. And they formed an organization called the Wood Organization Marketing Board and called a meeting to discuss it, and they elected me as their public relations officer because I have my finger on the pulse of the public. I said, you want to popularize wood? I'll tell you how. Ladies' clothes. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but in the last couple of years, women will wear dresses made of just anything. And they went round saying, wooden dresses, wooden dresses. And the more I heard them say it, the worse it sounded. And I said, no, wait a minute. We've got to be very careful because the word wood has the wrong association for fashion. The word wood sounds solid and dependable. And when a woman dresses, the last thing she wants to look is solid and dependable. She wants to look fallible and vaguely treacherous. So we must change the word wood. We must use a synonym for wood. And people suggested things like romantic mahogany or glamorous teak. Somebody said embraceable yew. And we decided this must be the area we must work in. Then somebody said, well, now, how can we cut wood thin enough to make a dress out of it? And somebody said, yes, we can if we use very thin wood to start with. We'll use what they call plywood. And the very thinnest of plywood, which is called 2-ply, we'll use 2-ply to make dresses out of that. That was agreed. Somebody then said, rather diffidently, but how will the women sit down? And everybody was so steamed up by that time, with that sort of like a chorus. They all said, hinges, you twit. So it was agreed to go ahead, with one proviso that the word plywood itself didn't have the requisite provocative sound to it. We had to call it something plywood, passionate plywood. No. And then I thought, why not call it after the name of the greatest lover in history, Don Juan? Don Juan Plywood. And that is what your dresses are going to be made of. I am giving you advance notice. Next year, it will be the plywood look for all. So if you are wise, I would go tomorrow to your own local timber yard and lay in some Don Juan plywood. Don't wait till it comes in the expensive West End timber yards. Do it today, locally. Buy Don Juan 2-ply in your yard.
Well, I think by the audience's vote, Denis Norden's story wins. I hope those hinges don't pinch, Denis. And it brings us to a final score in which Dilys Powell and Frank Muir win by 2 marks from Nancy Spain and Denis Norden. And it also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The program was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words. In this special Christmas edition, which comes from the Nursery's Recreation Hall at St. Peter's Hospital, Chertsey, near London, you'll hear Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. And for a change, we're going to start with a round without any marks, and this is just for fun, to test the ingenuity of the two teams. Each of the members of the two teams has got a cracker, a Christmas cracker, which I want them to pull. And, wait a bit, and inside each, I hope they'll find a motto. We'd carefully put the mottos in a bit earlier, so I think they're there. But only the first two lines of the motto is inside the cracker, and as everybody knows, Christmas cracker mottos normally have 4 lines. So I want the members of the two teams to compose the 2 missing lines which aren't there. Now, if you will pull your crackers... That's a bad one.
Awful cracker.
Oh, good.
That's mine.
That's
The
yours.
funny hat. What about the funny hat?
I've got some funny teeth. Can we keep them, Jack?
Yes, you can keep them.
Can we
That's
keep the
all right.
presents?
They have to be returned to the BBC for next year.
Can't open them.
All right, now I'm going to ask Dilys Powell to read out her motto, if she will. The first 2 lines.
Mine says, Christmas fare is rich and good, lots of turkey, lots of pud.
That's all right. That's a good start. Denis Norden, yours.
As the snow lay crisp and deep, all the kids lay fast asleep.
Yes, I can imagine what that may give rise to. Nancy Spain.
Coming home on Christmas Eve, father's steps began to weave.
And now Frank Muir.
Christmas games are oh so jolly, 'neath the mistletoe and the holly.
Well, after this diversion, we'll now go straight on to round 1, which tests the vocabulary of the two teams. 2 marks if they get the meaning of the following words approximately right. Beginning with Dilys Powell. Dilys, what is a veil? V-A-I-L, or it's more often in plural, veils, V-A-I-L-S.
Veils. Something rather sad. Or something
No,
rather,
it isn't.
Something rather jolly.
Last time you stayed in Windsor Castle,
Which I do frequently, yes.
what did you do just before you left?
We drew a
I
veil
left,
over
I
that.
I left a tip for somebody.
That's it.
It's a tip.
Yes?
You didn't.
Well, I think I gave you a bit of help there, Dilys. I'm going to give you 1.5 marks out of 2. It's a gift or gratuity, usually given to servants by guests who've been staying in your house for a weekend or something like this. Or it could be a present given for corrupt purposes, but you wouldn't ever do that.
No.
Denis Norden, what is a nixie? N-I-X-I-E. A nixie.
It sounds like a sort of negative pixie. It's a pixie who's just this moment vanished. leaving a kind of miasma, which is a nixie.
Well, like a neutron.
Yeah. It's where a pixie was.
Leaving her trousers
Just change
behind.
your sex.
I like the carefree way you say, just change your sex. I'm afraid you've got entirely the wrong hospital. Well, it's a male pixie.
All right, I'll give you 1 for calling it a pixie. It's a female water sprite or water elf. A male water elf is a nix and not a nixie, and a pixie is a small elf of sex indeterminate. I'm not certain about that one. Ondine, for instance, was a female water sprite. Nancy Spain, the meaning of the word maffic, M-A-F-F-I-C-K, maffic.
Well, I suppose it's tearing around and hindering traffic
Yes? Why?
because of Mafeking night.
What was that?
Well, a long time ago, Jack, before you were born,
That's quite true.
the Boer War was raging, and they had the relief of Mafeking, and everybody was very pleased, and they rushed into all the theatres in London, which at that time were open, and they shouted out, "Mafeking has been relieved!"
Quite right.
And everybody was very relieved and pleased, and they ran about all over the streets,
That's it. 2
waving
marks.
flags and...
That's it. You couldn't be righter. That's absolutely right, Nancy. It means to celebrate something extravagantly, as the populace of London and elsewhere celebrated the relief of Mafeking in the Boer War. Frank Muir, what is algidity?
Algidity. It's anything to do with frigidity.
Into...
With frigidity.
Yes, it could be. Yes, there is a sort of possible connection here, I think.
Well, it's frigidity,
Yes,
and it's not as cold
yes.
as though you were in the fridge. You're just left standing in the... algidity, that's all it is.
Well,
It's a state of cool.
Frank's quite right. It's what happens during a white Christmas, the state of being thoroughly cold. 2 marks, Frank. Well done. Well, before we start round 2, I give each team a quotation for them to write down, and I want the 2 women members of the team to study their quotations, and at the end of the programme, I shall ask them for the source from which those quotations come. So, Nancy Spain with Denis Norden. Your quotation is, "Joys like beauty are but skin deep." And Dilys Powell and Frank Muir, your quotation is, "She walks in beauty like the night." And then at the end of the programme, I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their ideas of how these words came to be said or written, and I don't want any of these answers yet. And so, round 2. At Christmas time, apart from pantomimes, theatres tend to put on certain shows which are brought out and dusted and presented every year with remorseless regularity. For 2 marks, with what traditional shows do you associate the following authors? For example, just as you associate Peter Pan with James Barrie. So Dilys Powell first, and here's the author, Brandon Thomas.
Charlie's aunt.
Charlie's aunt it is, 2 marks, well done. Denis Norden, Enid Blyton.
Noddy and son of Noddy and
Noddy's aunt.
Noddy Unchained.
I don't think Noddy was ever allowed in his sons. Noddy in something or other. Dennis.
Noddy in trouble. Noddy in despair. Noddy goes to pieces. Noddy in Toyland.
Noddy in Toyland it is, by Enid Blyton. And Nancy Spain, Kenneth Grahame.
The Wind in the Willows,
Yes,
otherwise known as Toad of Toad Hall.
Quite right. Toad of Toad Hall, play adapted from Kenneth Grahame's book, The Wind in the Willows. Now, Frank Muir. Lyman Frank Baum.
Wrote a book called The Wizard of Oz.
And the play of the same title.
Play is a play. There's a film called The Wizard of Oz. When I was young, I thought it was a man who could roll 50 cigarettes out of an ounce of tobacco.
All right.
Yes, it's a musical thing called The Wizard of Oz.
All right. The play is called The Wizard of Oz, and it comes from the book written by Lyman Frank Baum, which had the title The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Just that's the difference. Well, the next round concerns verses, or possibly poetry, and in this round I shall give each member of each team a quotation and ask them the following line or lines. 2 marks if they can finish off the quotation, possibly an extra mark for ingenuity or for rendering. Beginning with Dilys Powell, to complete, if you will, Dilys. "Come, landlord, fill the flowing bowl until it doth run over."
The next 2 lines are the same.
Yes, but I want you 2 more beyond that.
Oh,
'cause
that's
too simple.
4 lines. For tonight from Merry Merry Meg, and tomorrow will be...
Twice, you say it twice.
Oh, yes, right,
Tomorrow
yes.
will be
Everything comes twice. Tomorrow will be sober.
You didn't speak that with any conviction, did it? All right, that's good enough. 2 marks, and that comes from the Oxford Songbook. And now, Denis Norden. Good night, ladies. Good night, ladies.
Good night, ladies. You want me to sing this?
I want you to go on, too, if you will, and sing, please. Okay.
I don't generally sing without my group.
I'll be your group.
If you'll be the group,
I'll be the
the audience be the
Audience
group.
be the group.
Good night, ladies. I'll give you a count of 4. 4. Good night, ladies. Good night, ladies. Good night, ladies.
Until it doth
We're
run over.
going to leave you now. Merrily we roll along, roll along, roll along. Merrily we roll along. Across the deep blue sea. I must point out the high-pitched voice was Nancy's, particularly in view of certain comments made earlier in the
Well, 1 extra mark for Denis, making 3, and 1 in the jackpot for the audience. And now Nancy Spain. God bless the master of this house, likewise the mistress too, and all the little children that round the table grow. Or go. Some say one, some say the other.
But you've done it all.
No, I haven't. I want some more.
I don't think it'll get in the charts.
No.
We'll give it 5.
I never heard this.
Well, I mean, that's all I know of it.
Nancy, it's no good. As Lear said to Cordelia, nothing will come of nothing. So no marks.
Charming.
God bless the master of this house, likewise the mistress too, and all the little children that round the table grow. Love and joy come to you, and to you your wassail too, and we wish you a happy new year, and we wish you a happy new year.
Well, why didn't you say it before? We could have got 2 marks.
You just don't love us, that's all.
All right, now Frank Muir. It was on a Monday
ring
morning
you.
when I beheld my darling. She looked so neat and charming in every high degree.
She looks so neat and charming. It really was the sun. Dashing away with a smoothing iron, dashing away with a smoothing iron. She stole my heart away. She looked... She looked so neat and fancy, oh, ironing my pensy, oh. With a smoothing iron, she stole my heart away.
Yeah. 2.5 out of 3. It goes on. She looked so neat and charming in every high degree. She looked so neat and nimble, oh, a washing of her linen, oh, dashing away
Doesn't
with a
rhyme.
smoothing iron.
Mine rhymed.
The Oxford Songbook doesn't worry about things like
Mine
that.
rhymed. It's not fair to be done.
Dashing away with a smoothing iron, she stole my heart away.
2.5. Rotten 2.5. Rhymed. I'm going to put my paper hat on.
And now for those cracker mottos. I want the members of the team, in turn, to complete the incomplete mottos that they pulled out of their crackers at the beginning. So starting with Dilys Powell, and hers began, Christmas fare is rich and good, lots of turkey, lots of pud.
But I think you should be scary if you're offered cassowary.
That's fair enough. Denis Norden. As the snow lay crisp and deep, all the kids lay fast asleep.
I'll repeat that. As the snow lay crisp and deep, all the kids lay fast asleep. Mum was glum and Dad was glummer. You see, this was in the height of summer.
Now, Nancy Spain's motto, coming home on Christmas Eve, father's steps began to weave.
They heard him shouting on the roof. He'd got his weft right up his woof.
And finally, Frank Muir, Christmas games are oh so jolly, neath the mistletoe and the holly.
Come Boxing Day, no food and no beer, and a touch of Santa claustrophobia.
And now we come to the last round, and we go back to those two quotations I gave the teams earlier on in the programme. For 2 marks, Dilys Powell, can you give me the origin of your quotation, "She walks in beauty like the night"?
Byron.
Yes, in what, do you know?
A poem.
Yes, fair enough.
in rhyme, he asked.
Yes.
A painting.
Well, it's rather a short poem which begins that
Yes,
way.
it is. Yes, I
First
think that's
line.
good enough, because in some books of Byron, it is titled "She Walks in Beauty Like the Night," but oddly enough, it comes from a larger selection called Hebrew Melodies. Now, Nancy Spain, can I have the origin of your quotation, which was, "Joys like beauty are but skin deep"?
I don't know.
Well, I'm not the least surprised, Nancy, because it's a jolly difficult one. It was a chap called Philip James Bailey who wrote a tragedy, which was in fact performed, called Festus, which published in 1839, which was his English version of Faust. He was a great admirer of Goethe.
Very interesting.
Well, now I shall ask Frank and Denis to give me their explanation of how these quotations came into being, and on this occasion the marks will go to whichever incredible explanation receives the longer amount of applause from the audience here. So back to Frank Muir. She walks in beauty like the night.
She walks in beauty like the night. It's beautiful, isn't it? I very nearly didn't get married. A few days before the wedding, I discovered that my wife had got cold feet. It's no fun marrying somebody with cold feet. This was something of a trial in the first years of our marriage. For me, particularly, I overcame it eventually by a small device, which was an ordinary domestic hot plate strapped to the small of my back with surgical plaster. This worked quite well, really. It was rather painful in the mornings for me. I plugged it into the plug at the side of the bed. But latterly I've been rather worried about my wife's cold feet because she's got a job in this hospital, actually. She's assistant navigator on the library trolley, which comes round. She's hoping to be a pilot one day. She's studying for it. She's passed her going round the bed exam, but she failed on going through the swing doors. At the moment, she's just assistant navigator. And, of course, it means her walking from Thorpe to St. Peter's Hospital here every Wednesday afternoon, and her legs get very cold, you see. I was terribly worried about this. I tried 1 or 2 remedies to overcome it. I realised I'd have to encase the legs, really, lag them. But how to do it? And I thought of the success I'd had with strapping this hot plate onto the small of my back. So I got the element out of an electric blanket and wound it round my wife's legs and plugged it into the light. And it worked extremely well, except one had to have an awfully long lead. I had about 200 or 300 yards, which enabled my wife to shop in the little bicycle shop on the other side of the road, but no further, otherwise she'd come unplugged. Then I got the hay rake, and by thrusting that down the back of her dress with the top of the hay rake upwards, I reckoned I could get a sort of trolleybus system, you see, and put a contact on the top of that and run a power line from the house to St. Peter's Hospital, and my wife could walk along and be warm. I realised this was rather expensive, but if I got some other ladies who were making the journey, I could then sell them or rent them the equipment, and they could also travel. And I realised that this probably wouldn't work, because if my wife was going to Chertsey, it meant somebody coming from Chertsey to Thorpe. It means they'd have to carry one of those bamboo poles to hike the contact down. So that wasn't on. Then I thought, think simpler about this. And I suddenly thought, an armour, that's it. So I went to the pub, and I knew he had a whole lot of pewter tankards with a glass bit cracked. And so I bought all these from him for 1 and 4, and I soldered them together to make 2 sort of drain pipes out of these pewter tankards, and slit them on my wife's legs, just like the knight's armour. And then I filled them in, and we all filled it. We put granulated cork and old brick rubble and ashes and stuffed them down, and they work wonderfully. They really do. Because if my wife comes round navigating the library trolley and you see her walking in a rather peculiar, stiff-legged manner, don't mock. It is intentional. It's just that, as Byron said, she walks in pewter like the night.
Well, it's astonishing what Frank Muir's wife has to put up with. We'll pass on quickly to Denis Norden, and if you remember, his quotation was, "Joys, like beauty, are but skin deep."
During this season of indiscriminate present giving, I want to tell you about a friend of mine called Herbert. Now, practically exactly 16 years ago, I was with Herbert, and his wife was expecting a baby any moment. And he said to me, if I have a son, when he's 16, I would like to give him a Christmas present which would be something very, very, very special. Something which he has never had before, he's never seen, and he doesn't even know exists. I said, well, such as what? He said, a banana. I said, it's impossible. Now, as it happened, he had a son. Or rather, his wife had a son. Otherwise, the story would take on the trend that Jack was starting earlier in the program. 16 years ago. And Herbert set to work. The first thing he did was cleared all the bananas out of the house, cleared out all the pictures of bananas, all the references to bananas, all newspapers, books, magazines with anything to do with bananas in them, any banana songs. That was when the baby was very small. When they took the baby out in a pram, they would avoid all greengrocers' shops. They wouldn't go anywhere near any of those hoardings which say, unzip a banana. When the child went to parties at other children's places, Herbert would ring up the parents and say, look, would you mind, but when my son's there, would you mind putting all the bananas away and not talking or referring to bananas in any way? Which the other parents did. They're very good, other people, you find, with things like that. They don't say anything, they just take it and they do it. And they talk among themselves, of course, It's very funny about this chap Herbert and his, there must have been some awful tragedy in his family connected with a banana. And they made very interesting speculations about what it was and so on. And then, of course, the child couldn't go to school. He had to have a tutor all through his childhood. They had to watch very closely his entertainments, of course. Couldn't watch television at all because you get all sorts of references to bananas on television. And he succeeded. That was 16 years ago. That child never saw, heard, knew the existence of a banana. And this Christmas, he called the boy to the Christmas tree and he said, I've got your present. And he took down this little parcel which was shaped like a thin baby's bottle or little bent airship. And he said, open it. And the boy opened it and he said, that's lovely. What is it? And he said, that is a banana. The boy looked at it and he said, the things they think of. So where do I wear it? He said, you don't wear it, you eat it. Do you eat this? He said, yes. He said, this is what I've been striving for 16 years. You are now on the threshold of manhood. I'm going to give you an experience which is rare to any person at any time of life. That is enjoying a new sensual sensation. In your case, the taste of a banana for the very first time when you are in full possession of all your powers. This is a particular joy, and it's my present to you. And little tears came in the son's eyes. He said, Thanks, Dad. It was one of those sort of togetherness moments, which are rather lovely. And he said, "Go to your room, my son, and enjoy this joy which it has been my pleasure to give you." And the boy went to his room, and he ate the banana. And you know where he is now? He is in this hospital with a very, very bad tummy ache. Well, you see, you put yourself in his position. If you'd never seen a banana and somebody gave it to you to eat, would you know? No, you see, nor did he. It is another proof of the quotation that joys, like beauty, are but skin deep.
Well, by your vote, Denis Norden just wins in the contest between the two stories, and that brings us to a final score in which Dilys Powell and Frank Muir win by 1.5 marks from Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, and this also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The program was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the program and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. Here's round one to test their vocabulary. 2 marks if they get the meanings of these words right. Nancy Spain, the meaning of the word hydromel, H-Y-D-R-O-M-E-L, hydromel.
Oh, I came on a recipe for this the other day.
Jolly good.
In my grandmother Spain's rough notebook. It's a, it's a mixture of honey and lemon juice and water, and is very, very good for the cough.
Quite right. 2 marks. Frank Muir, the meaning of the word ultimogeniture, U-L-T-I-M-O-G-E-N-I-T-U-R-E.
Ultimo means last.
Yes?
Gen is information. Which, it's the late news summary.
No, it's a rather particular kind of gin. I think your partner would help you.
Birth? That's
With an I.
geniture.
Yes, that's more like it.
Ultimogeniture, the last birth.
Yes, now we're getting nearer.
Am I near enough?
No. I'll give you a half mark. It's the system in which the youngest or last son takes the property or inheritance, as opposed to primogeniture, which is the usual thing, where the eldest son inherits everything. Dilys Powell, the meaning of the word nidification, N-I-D-I-F-I-C-A-T-I-O-N, nidification.
Just do with
Well, Jack,
economic progress.
yes, it is economic progress because when my husband and I were furnishing a house, and I would go out to work, to earn the rent, I used to come back with a waste paper basket, or, waste paper basket, or an old knife without a handle.
That's right, yeah.
And my husband used to say I was nesting.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
In fact, I was making a nest. I was indulging in nidification.
Quite right. 2 marks. It's the building of nests from a Latin word. Denis Norden, this is a bit tough, too.
I am not afraid.
What is an opsimath?
Opsimath. Oh, yes, yes. I've got it. I don't want it, but... opsi... Well, math is easy, that's from sun. Opsi is when a child falls down on the ground. It's generally combined with the word daisy to form the word opsi-daisy. Now, if a child falls down on his arithmetic, then you would say opsi-math.
Yes, you would. You would. But you better define it in some other word, otherwise I can't help you very much.
I can't help myself very much with this one, Jack.
I think 1 out of 2, you've got the main idea behind it. It's a late developer. It's one who learns late in life, and it comes from the Greek.
Oh.
Well, before we start round 2, I give each team a quotation for them to write down, and the 2 women members of the team then study their quotations throughout the program, and at the end, I shall ask them where those quotations come from. Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, your quotation is, "In the great right of an excessive wrong." And Dilys Powell with Frank Muir, your quotation is, "I'm going to wash that man right out of my hair." Rather a clue there, wasn't it? And then at the end of the program, I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their ideas of how these words came to be said or written, and I don't want any of these answers yet. So to round 2. I want to know how well you know your Gulliver's Travels by Swift. And during his travels, Lemuel Gulliver met a number of strange creatures, some of them human in shape and some of them not. For 2 marks, who or what were the following? Nancy Spain, who was Glumdalclitch?
Oh, my heavens. I'm sure he was a giant. He was one of the big ones in Brobdingnag.
It was that
Wrong sex, but-
objectionable little girl.
Oh, yes, she picked him up in the marrowbone or something and squeezed
No, that was the
him.
dwarf. But near enough. The dwarf was nasty and stuffed him into a marrowbone.
But Grumdalnet, your friend.
Was a,
My friend Glumdalclitch, yes.
was a-
Grumdal, you should be ashamed.
I think you're near enough. I think 2 marks.
Thank you, Denis Norden.
She was a young girl, but she was very small for her age. She was not above 40 feet high, being little for her age. You see, this was the country of the giants, and she wasn't a very big one. And she was nurse to Gulliver and looked after him when he visited Brobdingnag, and it means my little nurse. Frank Muir, who were the big Indians and the little Indians?
A moment to get my bearings. In Lilliput, there were 2 causes of strife. One was internal and one was external. The internal ones were whether you wore big heels or small heels. There was also internal dissension over whether you hit your egg
Yes.
on the big end and the little end.
Yes?
Because they used to hit it on the big end, and the emperor's grandfather, when a boy, hit the big end and his knife slipped and he cut his thumb.
Yes.
They were then ordained to, all Lilliputians must hit their egg on the little end. But the old diehards wouldn't do this, and they were banished from the kingdom to Blefuscal.
Well done.
And they then had little wars between them and little forage parties and little forays. And they consulted the Quran, which said that all believers hit their egg on the convenient end, which they both claimed was the little and big, respectively.
Absolutely wonderful and accurate, and I think Frank deserves a bonus mark for that. I'm going to give him 3. And it was, of course, as he suggests, a satire on the feuds between the churches, and with definite reference to the Reformation in England, turning from Catholic to Protestant, and Henry VIII being the sort of catalyst. And the quotation from their Bible, the Blunderkral, was all true believers break their eggs at the convenient end. Now, Dilys Powell, who were the Houyhnhnms and the Yahoos? Houyhnhns and the Yahoos.
Well, the Houyhnhnms were the nice ones.
Yes.
And the Yahoos were the dirty ones.
Yes.
The Houyhnhnms were horses.
They were.
Well, the Yahoos were, well, they weren't horses.
No.
They were more disagreeable.
What?
Or were they?
Nasty people.
Just horrors. Just dirty people. They were very dirty.
Walking on how many legs?
Oh.
I think 1.5, Dilys. This is the last book of Gulliver's Travels. The Houyhnhnms were intelligent and absolutely charming horses, and their simplicity and virtue was contrasted with these beastly creatures, the Yahoos, who were sort of debased human beings, and brutal and vulgar and nasty and dirty. It was Swift's final attack on human beings. 1.5 marks. Denis Norden, who were the Struldbrugs? Struldbrugs. Struldbrugs.
I can only remember vaguely that I loved him and hated her.
Something to do with getting sunlight out of cucumber.
Yes, that's the right book.
I am informed from usually reliable sources that it was something to do with getting sunlight out of cucumber.
There was a flat land like
yes,
that.
Was.
So, Michael, would you like to take over?
With a point on the top, and the Struldbugs, or whatever they were called, were devoted to extracting, this weird way of life.
Half a mark for trying very hard. This was the time he visited the land of Laputa, and as Nancy quite right, this was sort of an enormous flying saucer which was up in the air. And here were people who were the early scientists whom Swift satirized, but among them were to be found these wretched creatures, the Struldbrugs, who were condemned to immortality. And it wasn't much fun for them, because though they went on and on forever, they got more and more stupid and more weak and more frail the longer they went on. So this put a stopper to the idea it was a nice thing to live forever. Well, the next round is verse and poetry. I give each member of the team a quotation and ask them for the following line or lines to complete it. 2 marks if they can go on successfully, and 2 more for naming author and book if they know it. Beginning with Nancy Spain. They love the good, they worship truth, they laugh uproariously in youth.
And when they start to getting old, they up and shoot themselves, I'm told. Rupert Brooke.
Yes.
Grantchester.
Yes, quite right. Well done, Nancy. That's 4 marks. It's Rupert Brooke, the old vicarage, Grantchester. They love the good, they worship truth, they laugh uproariously in youth, and when they get to feeling old, they up and shoot themselves, I'm told. Well done, Nancy. Frank Muir. Kathleen Mavourneen, the grey dawn is breaking.
Kathleen Mavourneen, the grey dawn is breaking. Home is the hunter with horn from the hill, so I better take you home again. It's an Irish song.
We gathered that. By...
That Irishman O'Non.
No, try it this morning.
Well, again, difficult to mark. 2, I think, for knowing it, the next line more or less, rather less than more, and knowing it was Irish. Kathleen Mavourneen, the grey dawn is breaking. The horn of the hunter is heard on the hill. The lark from her light wing, the bright dew is shaking. Kathleen Mavourneen, what? Slumbering still. It goes on like that for a very long time. And it's by Julia Crawford. And
she.
Written in 1835 and first appeared in the Metropolitan magazine, London. 2, I think. Dilys Powell. Here's a health unto His Majesty with a fel la 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 la.
Oh, I know the next line to this.
If you will not drink his health, something
Yes.
or other, you... Something... Come on, Frank.
He didn't do enough la-las.
No.
He did another
La la
line
la
of
la
love.
la 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 la. It goes on like that.
La 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 la.
There we are, that's all we need.
What's the
Those
next
who will not
line?
drink his health, I wish them neither something nor wealth.
Yes, and who's it by?
Who's it by? Oh dear.
You talked about this before.
Talked about this before?
Frank did.
Anon.
Anon.
All right, I think 3.5 would be fairly
Anon.
generous marking here. It's a song. He has a health unto His Majesty, a 17th century song, I think. He has a health unto His Majesty with a fa-la-la-la-la-la, like that. Conversion to his enemies, that's the line he must out, and then a lot more fals and lals and las. And he that will not pledge his health, I wish him neither wit nor wealth, nor yet a rope to hang himself, with a fa-la-la-la-la-la-la. Very difficult.
La.
Right, back to Denis Norden. Alas, my love, you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously.
Oh, this is another singing one.
Yes?
I'm not going to sing it without my group. Alas, my love, you do me
That's right.
wrong to cast me off discourteous. What did you say? Yes, and it ends green sleeves.
That's it, yes. All right. By whom?
Well, it's attributed to Henry VIII.
Yes, all right, this is getting better. 3.5 marks. It's probably anonymous, but some people have attributed it to Henry VIII. It's called a new courtly sonnet of the Lady Greensleeves to the new tune of Greensleeves, and it appeared in a book called A Handful of Pleasant Delights in 1584. Next round is the who, where, and what department. For 2 marks, who or what were the following in what work? Nancy Spain. Who lived at Thornfield Hall?
Jane Eyre.
Only temporarily. Who really lived there?
Well, Mr. Rochester
Yes,
and
that's
his
all right.
friends.
Yes, 2 marks. Frank Muir. Where was Manderley?
Oh, I knew the road very well. The Flying Fishes and the Flotilla. In a book by Daphne du Maurier.
Yes.
It was the house to which Max de Winter brought his anonymous bride.
Yes.
We knew she was Mrs. de Winter, but we never knew her first name. And Mandalay was the great house there by the sea.
Haunted by?
Haunted by, overshadowed rather,
Yes.
by the memory of the first Mrs. de Winter, what was done in evilly in the waters which tumbled below the cliff.
All right, 2 marks. The house dominated by the dead wife, Rebecca, in Daphne du Maurier's novel. Denis Powell, what was the first novel which introduced Sherlock Holmes?
Not the Sign of 4. A Study in Scarlet.
Well done, yes. All right there. Denis Norden, who were Edward and Jane Murdstone?
Mr. Murdstone was the original evil stepfather
Yes,
in David Copperfield.
quite right.
Jane, obviously, was some relation. Jane was with him, you know. It was always Edward and Jane Murdstone. One didn't sort of pry into what they were to each other. I think we'd best leave it at that.
1.5 out of 2. Edward Murdstone was, as Dennis rightly says, David Copperfield's stepfather, and Jane was his sister, and they were very unkind and sent David's mother to an early grave, and then saw that David was ill-treated in a school where he was bullied by the headmaster. Now we come to the last round and go back to those 2 quotations I gave the teams earlier in the programme. 2 marks. Nancy Spain, can you give me the origin of your quotation? In the great right of an excessive wrong.
Something very obscure from Browning.
Yes, it's not the most obscure of the lot, but perhaps the second most obscure. It comes in the middle of that very long poem, The Ring and the Book, in the great right of an excessive wrong. And now, Denis Powell, would you give me the origin of your quotation? It's a bit easier, I think. I'm going to wash that man right out of my hair.
It's a song in South Pacific by Rogers and Hammerstein.
Yes, quite right. Well, now I'm going to ask Dennis and Frank to give me their explanation of how these quotations came into being. And on this occasion, the marks will go to whichever unlikely explanation receives the longer and larger amount of applause from the audience here in the studio. So back to Denis Norden and his quotation, "In the great right of an excessive wrong."
This phrase last occurred to me during a period of my life when I was running a matrimonial agency. And at the time in question, we were having our January sale. We were, I think, the only matrimonial agency that did have a sale 3 times a year in which we endeavoured to get rid of what we called our remnants. These were ladies and gentlemen that no other ladies and gentlemen particularly fancied, and we used to let them go at cut price. And at this time we had cleared our books except for these 2, one man and one lady. And the man was 5'1" and very skinny. And his name was Jack Longland. No relation at all. It was just one of those happy coincidences. And the lady was quite different. Her name was Emma Williamson. She was 6'8", and she weighed 16 stone. Now, I had a wild idea how we could close our books for this year, and that was to pair these 2 off. Now, this was the strange part. She fell for him immediately, like a ton of bricks. And on his side, love took a little longer to blossom. He used to take her out a lot. He saw a lot of her. Well, there was a lot of her to see, you see. And eventually the chemistry happened. Jack came to me one day and he said, "Well, I never thought I would, but I have. I have fallen in love with this mountain of womanhood." He said, I love her, I want to marry her, but our love can never be anything more than a meeting of minds because of this disparity in our stature." And then I had the sort of thought which justify the place of matrimonial agencies in our economy. I said, "You see that chandelier up there?" I said, "We clean that once a week. Do you know what with? A small folding ladder." I said, "It's yours." I said, "Take the ladder away, Jack. Take it to her apartment, go in her drawing room, climb up it, propose, and then if she accepts you, then you may seal the acceptance in the only way an acceptance can be sealed." He said, "But I can't just, it's so embarrassing." He said, "I can't take a ladder into a lady's drawing room." What do I say if she says, "Why are you climbing up that ladder?" Tell her because it's there. Which he did, and he went away, and that was where the tragedy came. That was where the phrase, "in the great right of an excessive wrong," sprang to my mind. Because not 2 hours after he'd left, I received a phone call from Emma. She was distraught, hysterical. She said, "Quick, come where my love lies bleeding." So I made my way to her house, and there in the drawing room, in the fireplace, lay poor little Jack Longland, limp and broken. I saw immediately what had happened. I took the ladder and I placed it against Emma. The ladder was too high. It had one rung too many. And you see what had happened? In his joyous haste, he'd rushed up the ladder, shot clean over her head, and landed in the fireplace. There he lay, where he had fallen, in the grate, right off an excessive rung.
as that story was clearly actionable, I shan't comment on it until I've consulted my solicitor. We'll pass on to Frank Muir, and your quotation, Frank, was, "I'm going to wash that man right out of my hair."
I must ask you to forgive me if my voice seems a little white with excitement, but in half an hour's time, the Royal Albert Hall, I'm going to realize a lifelong ambition. I'm going to present to the world an entirely new form of artistic expression. This has always been my dream, and at last I've achieved it. I've always tried to do this. I'm what's called a compulsive innovationist. We might say a constructive iconoclast. Or to use the psychiatric word, a nut. Ever since I was quite young, ever since I was quite young, I've invented things and tried to introduce new things. All the latest musical thing was this reading beat poetry to cool jazz. I thought, this is so old hat. You know, it's time for something really new and break away. So I mounted a concert where I read a Board of Trade report to the London Philharmonic Orchestra. This, unfortunately, wasn't a success. I should have foreseen this, of course, because nobody could hear me. I was drowned out by the orchestra. And whilst still on the subject of music, I had my great inspiration, what I could give to the world. Song. Now think of a song. What is a song? A song is words which are sung. What? You may ha-ha. And I trust you will continue to do so for the next 2 minutes. My breakthrough was music which is spoken. Impossible, you say, this is communism. But it is possible. I have written a tune. I call it Air on a Larynx. It isn't sung, it's spoken. It's spoken by a man. It's quite simple. I'll give you, if I can remember, I'll give you just the opening. Yes, it's A flat, A, B, E, D, B sharp major, E, and so it goes on for an hour and 20 minutes. Spoken music, a breakthrough. Of course, they all laughed at me. They all said, this can't be. We can't have this. They upraised the twin fingers of scorn. They said... But I've defeated them. I've hired the Albert Hall for tonight. And I've hired an actor called George Wright or Basil Wright or some Wright or other. He's doing it for 30 bob and a trip home to Pinner afterwards. And he's learnt my air tonight by heart, and he's going to speak it on the stage of the Albert Hall. And can you wonder, I'm excited. They said it couldn't be done, but it's going to be done. After the show, I'm going to the Albert Hall, and with my very own eyes, I'm going to watch that man Wright utter my air.
Make it very difficult for me. I think Frank Muir wins by very narrow margin indeed, and that brings us to a final score in which the margin is about as narrow as it might be, because Dilys Powell and Frank Muir win by 1 mark from Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, and that also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The programme was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the programme and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. And here's round one to test their vocabulary. 2 marks if they can give me the meaning of the following words approximately right. Beginning with you, Nancy Spain. What is a Jacobus? Jacobus. Jacobus.
A Jacobus.
That's it?
Something to do with the reign of the Jameses.
Yes, that's right.
James the First?
Yes, that'll do. But I want to know what it is.
It's a coin of the reign of James the First.
You're dead right. It's an English gold coin of the reign of James the First, worth, rather curiously, either 20 or 24 shillings. I don't quite understand why. Frank Muir, the meaning of the word herbarium, H-E-R-B-A-R-I-U-M, herbarium.
H-E-R-P?
No, B for Betty.
Eh?
What made you think of Betty?
Herbarium. Let's break this down. That's the way to do it. Latin. Reum. Reum is Muir backwards. Herbarium. Well, yes. I was getting out of the bath backwards this morning, and my wife came in and saw a herbarium.
It must have been awfully dirty if she did.
Is it anything to do with herbs?
Yes, that'll do. Yes.
Barium meal made of herbs.
No, stick to the first line.
Herbarium.
Yes.
Is this a thing like a planetarium? Any herbs?
Yes, that's it.
Oh, it's a thing. Yes, it's where herbs are. You have your herbs, and you've got to keep them together because the slightest part they're dried.
That's it. That's absolutely right.
All
right. I
can read his mind.
I think you creep home, Frank. It's a collection of dried plants, or a room, or it could be a case or a book in which you keep your dried plants, unlike an aquarium, where the fish are wet and not dry. 2, all right. Dennis Powell, the meaning of mavourneen. I can't say it, but mavourneen.
It's a dear little Irish colleen.
Yes, but what's it mean?
Mavourneen.
My little darling, I mean.
Yes?
My little darling, it means.
My darling, you needn't all that little, some of them
My
are 8 feet
darling.
high. 2 marks it is, my darling, and I won't even try and pronounce the Gaelic from which it comes. Denis Norden, what is a barbican? B-A-R-B-I-C-A-N.
Can is a tin. Baba is a sheep. It's tinned sheep. It's what they live on during a siege.
Chicken from the States. No. You've got to try another
It's to
line.
replace broiler fowl, no? Yeah. It's something to do with a city, isn't it?
Fortification.
It's a fortification.
Outside fortification.
I have an idea it's an outside.
It's the outer wall keep.
I would even go as far as to say it's the outer wall keep.
All right. Barbican is the outer defence to a city or a castle, and more particularly the kind of double tower that used to put over the gate or the bridge. 2 marks, Dennis. Well, before we start round 2, I give each team a quotation for them to write down, and I want the 2 women members of the team to study their quotations, and at the end of the programme I shall ask them where those quotations come from. And Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, your quotation is, the bigger they come, the harder they fall. And Dilys Powell with Frank Muir, yours is, I have nothing to declare except my genius. And then at the end of the programme I shall ask Denis and Frank to give me their ideas of how these words came to be said or written, and I don't want any of these answers yet. And so to round 2, to what or to whom were the writers referring when they wrote the following lines? 1 mark for an accurate answer and 1 for naming who the writer was. Beginning again with Nancy Spain. With all thy faults, I love thee still.
England by England.
Yes, that's one half of it. Author?
England with all thy faults and ugly still. There must be somebody far away, overseas.
18th century pal of yours, Nancy.
It's not going to be Lord Byron.
No, too late.
No.
All right, 1 out of 2, Nancy. It was Cooper in the task, and he, as we say, was referring to England. Frank Muir, it combines the maximum of temptation with the maximum of opportunity.
What does it?
That's what I want.
I was writing out my line, actually, while you were doing the preamble. Oh, we've got to do that, have we? Is that one? What is it?
It combines the maximum of temptation with the maximum of opportunity.
Surely
What is referred to?
Surely that's going and fetching for somebody else 2 large ice cream cornets. It's impossible not to have a lick. Is it marriage?
Yes.
Oh.
That's right. It's marriage, and who wrote it?
Wilde.
No?
Sure.
No.
Eh?
Sure.
Are you sure?
No. I'm not sure. But
My other voice thinks sure.
All right. Marriage,
Which Shaw?
Bernard Shaw, in Maxims for Revolutionists, marriage combines the maximum of temptation with the maximum of opportunity. 2 marks. Denis Powell, earth hath not anything to show more fair.
Wordsworth,
Yes?
talking about the view from Westminster Bridge of London.
Quite right. 2 marks. Denis Norden, though more than half the world was his, he died without a rood his own, and borrowed from his enemies 6 feet of ground to lie upon.
Well, it would be about some ruler.
Yes?
Alexander,
No, later than that. A lot later.
Napoleon.
Yes? That's one of your marks. Do you remember who wrote it?
No.
I think it's jolly difficult. Thackeray, writing about Napoleon, 1 out of 2. The next round's about the origin and derivation of phrases. 3 marks for the best answer for the origin of these rather familiar expressions. And I may give a mark or 2 for ingenuity if accuracy is a bit lacking. Nancy Spain, to look with a jaundiced eye.
A jaundiced eye?
Mm-hmm.
Well, these people had yellow eyeballs. And they had been looking with these yellow eyeballs for a very long while. And they were very much given to drinking and, you know...
Not with jaundice.
No. They started off drinking. They had these terrible livers, you see.
That's it.
Yes. But what are you seeing, Nancy, when you've got jaundice?
What am I seeing? Little black spots.
Won't do. No, it's not black spots.
Yellow spots.
Yes. It was a popular belief that anyone suffering from this beastly disease of jaundice saw everything with a yellow tinge to it. And Pope, in one of his poems on criticism, says, all seems infected, that the infected spy, as all seems yellow to the jaundiced eye. And it's jolly nearly true. 2 out of 3. Frank Muir, the phrase lantern jawed, how did that originate?
Lantern jawed means cadaverous,
Mm-hmm.
sunken cheeks, and square, bony jaw, and a rather general sort of drooping countenance.
And
It's
why
not
is that
a
like
happy
a
man.
Why is that like a lantern?
Well, something's got on his wick.
I think again,
Full
2 out of
marks.
3. You missed 1 point.
What's that? Come
That-
on, what's that?
The face was so thin that the light showed through it, just like a lantern.
But
Your
his jaw?
cheeks were almost transparent.
But you say lantern-cheeked.
I'm sorry, I didn't
It
invent the
shows through his
phrase.
jaw. If you put a torch in your mouth, it shines through your cheek. It doesn't shine through your jaw,
You can
Jack.
see through your cheek, yes. I think 2 out of 3 is not unfair. Denis Powell, the origin of the phrase to peg out.
Peg out?
Mm-hmm.
Origin, where it means to die, to sort of give up.
Yes.
Peg out. I thought you pegged out the grave.
No, that's a nice idea. I don't think
It is.
that's
I think it's
lovely
rather nice.
No,
yeah.
it's sports and games. You've got to
Peg
think
out.
of.
Peg out. Peg out a ground for some game.
Now, you're using the word peg out in the wrong sense, I think. It comes from the game of cribbage, in which you've got a board with a whole series of holes in it, 61, I think, and you go on putting the peg, or your peg and your opponent's peg, up and up and up, until you finally reach the 61st hole, and when you reach that, the game is ended because you've pegged out. And if you don't like that explanation, there is another one. In the game of croquet, you hit the peg with the ball in your final stroke, which also means to peg out. So I don't really think I can give you any marks at all.
Not my game.
Pity. Denis Norden. Origin of the phrase, a dead heat.
Well, it means draw. You have to have a photo finish. Yeah.
Yeah.
I never thought it had an origin. Some things you don't think of as having origins. They were always there.
They have heats in sports.
Heats. I tell you what it was. I tell you exactly what it was. If you just give me a quarter of an hour or so. In Wales, they used to have miners' races, where the miners used to bet all their weekly money on who would win. And if there was a draw, then there was no race, and they used to pelt the runners with coal. Now, when you come to think of it, coal is dead heat. You may have some specious explanation which you offer, but
I much prefer yours, Dennis.
So do I.
But I don't know if I can give you any marks. Oh, yes, I will. One for ingenuity. Well, two explanations. One is that it's a dead or wasted heat because you have to run it all over again so as to find the chap who's going to win, otherwise the bets aren't any good. The other one is that there is a special sense of dead which means exact or complete, like dead calm, dead earnest, dead certainty, dead loss, etc. So either of those you can pick, neither of which I think you gave. But one anyway, Dennis, I think you earned that.
Oh, well, it's very good, really.
Well, the next round is a round of X questions. I want to know for 2 marks what the following expressions, all of which begin with EX, mean. Nancy Spain, ex gratiae.
Oh, I call that ex gratia.
so do I. Yeah.
Well, some
Without thanks.
snobs were brought up in the new pronunciation. You've seen some word.
Well, you know how common I am, Jack.
Ex-
I would say without thanks or grace, you know, without any...
No.
It's without obligation,
Yeah, without obligation, yeah.
without being under an obligation
That's
to
it.
do
Yeah,
it.
yes.
That's right.
Everybody please themselves and
It's as
without
of,
pay.
It's as of grace as opposed to something given by obligation. So an ex gratia payment is one that has no legal obligation, but is payment made out of goodwill, and there's no contractual bond either now or in the future.
I remember
2
the
marks.
cheese on.
Thank you.
So gratin. Sorry, sir. Listen.
Thank you. Ex officio.
Ah, yes, by virtue of office.
Yes. Meaning?
Well, you know, there'll be 7 members elected by the committee, and of course Ted will have to be here as secretary because he's ex officio. It means that by virtue of another office he holds, he can bother you.
That's it. That's all right. Like a Lord Mayor, who tends to be a member of various committees, ex officio means when he stops being Lord Mayor, he normally stops being member of those committees. 2 marks. Dilys Powell. Ex libris.
It means out of your books. In fact, it means belonging to your library.
And
You use it as a bookmark.
That's it. From the collection of, usually written in the flyleaf of a book or printed on a book plate, and it might be your name or your crest or coat of arms or what have you. And
Well, I haven't got those.
It means you've got your own library, and this is one of the books out of your own library. 2 marks. Denis Norden. Ex parte. P-A-R-T-E. Ex parte.
That's very difficult to explain. At least it's for me. If my wife told you something and you came up to me and said, "What is all this about you and Nancy Spain?" I would say you have only heard an ex parte account.
Yes?
We are just good friends. It means a one-sided, only hearing one side without taking the other side.
I think that gets you home and dried, Dennis. They're not in the instance that you quoted. It's coming from only one of the parties, in the interests of one side only, a partial statement without the other side being able to come in and challenge it or cross-examine. And now we come to the last round and go back to the quotations I gave the two teams earlier on in the programme. 2 marks. First of all, Nancy Spain, you give me the origin of your quotation, which was, "The bigger they come, the harder they fall."
Well, I'm told it's a boxer called Bob Fitzsimmons.
And you're absolutely right. Heavyweight champion of the world, quite a long time ago, but the sort of biggest with the mostest. 2 marks. And Dilys Powell, the origin of your quotation, which was, "I have nothing to declare except my genius."
It was said by Oscar Wilde on his arrival in the United States.
You're absolutely right. One takes it with a pinch of salt. He certainly wouldn't have been appointed to a foreign embassy these days, but it's his Oscar Wilde's quotation. And now I'm going to ask Denis and Frank to tell me their explanation of how each quotation came into being, and on this occasion the marks will go to whichever unlikely explanation gets the longer and louder amount of applause from the audience here in the studio. And so back to Denis Norden and his quotation, "The bigger they come, the harder they fall."
Did I ever tell you about the time that I worked on a banana boat? This wasn't a boat that carried bananas. It was a boat that was shaped like a banana. It's what they call a gondola. I was working on this gondola as gondolier's mate at the end of a holiday in Venice because of some misinformation I'd been given about the number of lira to the pound. So, to pay the hotel bill, I took this job on the gondola. He used to stand at the sharp end and sing O Sole Mio, and I stood at the rear end and sang O Sole Mio. So you had what was, in effect, a stereophonic gondola. But it was the shape, this banana shape, that roused my interest in bananas. And as soon as the bill was paid for the hotel, I wended my way to a banana plantation in Guatemala, which is a heck of a long wend, particularly by gondola. And there I was made overseer of a very large banana plantation. My job was to see that the fruit, the bananas, were picked on time. Timing was very important because the banana plantation was owned by an ice cream company who were aiming to make banana the flavor of the month for November. So everything had to be off the trees by then, which wasn't easy because, you see, bananas grow 20 feet high, 20 feet up on the tree, and the workers had to shin up the bark and shake the branch so that the bananas fell to the ground, which they refused to do because they had an agitator among them and demanded ladders. I scoured Guatemala for ladders everywhere, from Antigua to Sierra Madre Mountains. I couldn't find a ladder anywhere. Then I had a brainwave. I sent to England for a shipment of beer. Then I called my workers to me and I said, "This is an English delicacy called wallop or pig's ear." I said, "I want you to taste it. And if you like it, as soon as that fruit is picked, there'll be a gallon for every man." Well, they sipped it, they strained it, they swallowed it. You've never seen such a happy lot of Guatemalans in your life. Straight away, there and then, they elected to call harvesting day Pig's Ear Day. I got the biggest crop of bananas that had ever been picked in Guatemala. And to this day, that custom still survives. They serve beer on what is called Pig Ear Day. And in fact, the new calypso out there, the one that's replaced Daylight Come and I Want to Go Home, is the one that goes, the pig ear day come, banana they fall.
Well, that's a very good calypso indeed. And we go on to Frank Muir, and you'll remember that his quotation was, I have nothing to declare except my genius.
When I'm walking in the streets, people often come up and stop me and ask me questions, quite ordinary questions. They ask me things like, do you realize you've only got one sock on? I usually take them to a cafe for a currant bun and talk to them because I like people. And the question I'm frequently asked is how I spend my time in between my word programs. Well, of course, I live in a village, and village life is very full and busy. I mean, today, for instance, what have I done today? I swept the drawing room chimney and put up 16 pounds of strawberry jam. After that, I did a bit of good. I went for a walk. I went for a 5-mile walk. Actually, I was breaking in a new pair of boots for the vicar, and then I came home after that and sorted through my mail, because I get quite a lot of letters from people who listen to the program from all over the world. I would very much like to reply personally to all the nice letters that people have sent me complimenting me on my performance, but I'm sure you realise that this is quite impossible because I haven't had any. Funnily enough, oddly enough, the letters I get aren't complimentary at all. But some of them I found very comforting because I've pasted them around the French windows. There's a crack and the draft used to come through, and I've pasted these round. The first one said, Dear Mr. Muir, you are a low-down, stinking rotter. You should be destroyed. I only wish that one day you will walk out in the dark and fall down a well. Signed, a well-wisher. Well, I don't mind letters like that. At least he had the decency to write. Didn't actually have the decency to put a stamp on. It cost me 6pence, but it's a mauve crayon. It's an odd thing to write. I don't know anybody who writes him, except, oddly enough, Denis Norden, who... Oh, I hadn't thought... No, never mind. The other... the second letter down, where the crap was, it says that, Dear Mr. Muir, I am an elocution teacher, and every time I hear you talking on my word, the way you mispronounce your R's goes through me like a red-hot spear. It causes me a physical pain. I've discovered your secret. You drink too much gin. I have discovered by experiment that too much gin numbs the tongue and makes it lazy, so that when you come to an R, instead of your tongue going forward against your teeth and making a normal R, it stays flabbily where it is and doesn't bother. That's why you mispronounce your R's, too much gin. I wouldn't listen, except my wife forces me to listen as a punishment because I don't like her mother. I think my wife hates me. In fact, she has only spoken to me 17 times since we were married. Signed, father of 17. Which... It's really quite young to be a father. And this morning, oddly enough, when I opened my mail, I found a letter which was even worse than the others, and it really plunged me into gloom. It said, Dear Mr. Muir, I cannot think why you have been chosen to be on that program. You are entirely incompetent. You know very little about English literature. You know very little about the meanings or origins of words. And I cannot think what you are doing there. You have no qualification whatsoever which raises you above a million other non-entities. It's that I challenge you to name one thing you have that other people haven't. Yours, etc., Teddy Clare. I felt terribly gloomy about this. I was very upset. I thought and thought, have I anything that other people haven't got? Have I any distinguishing mark of feature or quality at all? And I realized I have nothing, and I stood looking out of my window at the countryside, trying to see something worth looking at, and suddenly I started reading my little collection of fan mail pasted over the crack, and I realized that I do have one little thing. So I wrote off to Mr. Clare, and do you know what I wrote? I wrote, I have nothing, Teddy Clare, except my ginny hours.
Well, I don't know about you, I'm nearly in tears, but I know where to take Frank afterwards. Anyway, that's going to be a help. Well, I don't know how to mark this. I think you gave almost exactly the same amount of applause to both stories, and so I'm going to declare this particular one a tie between the two. And that brings us to a final score in which Dilys Powell and Frank Muir just get home by 2 marks from Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, and it also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The program was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC. The BBC presents My Word. And here to introduce the program and the panel is Jack Longland.
My Word is a word game played by people whose business is words, and those taking part are Nancy Spain, Dilys Powell, Denis Norden, and Frank Muir. Round 1 attempts to test their vocabularies. 2 marks if they get the meanings of these words approximately right. Beginning with Dilys Powell. Dilys, the meaning of the word hebitude, H-E-B-E-T-U-D-E, hebitude.
Hebitude?
Hebitude, yes, it's almost prunes and prisms sort of word.
Hebitude, I'm not in the hebitude. Hebitude, stupidity.
You're absolutely right, it's stupidity. Well done. 2 marks. Denis Norden, what is a scut? S-C-U-T, scut.
Scut. It's either a rabbit's tail, or it's what happens to a suggestive remark that is made on this recording.
Well done. You're dead right, Dennis. I was afraid you were going to say it was the opposite to a Girl Guide, but never mind. It can be the short tail of a hare, or a rabbit, or a deer, or any animal which has not as much tail as it otherwise might have. Nancy Spain, what is a mezzanine?
It's in between the ground floor and the first floor.
Well, that might be almost anything.
What you have on a birthday cake, isn't it? Just underneath the icing.
But I still want to know what it is. You've described its location.
It's a floor.
That's fair enough, all right. It's a rather low-browed story between two higher ones, and Nancy, quite right, he says normally between the ground and the first floors. 2 marks. Frank Muir, what's the meaning of Herbie? H-E-R-B-Y.
Herbie? Oh, it's just Herbie, you know, like E is a thing appertaining to a cellar is called celery. So a Herbie is appertaining to a herb. Herbaceous.
Yes, that's near enough.
Herb-like.
Yes, herb-like is one of the two meanings of the nature of a herb, or it could be abounding in herbs, which or herbaceous brought it may, I don't know. Well, before we begin round 2, I give each team a quotation for them to write down, and then I want the 2 women members of the team to study their quotations, and at the end of the programme, I shall ask them where those quotations come from. Dilys Powell and Frank Muir, here's your quotation. And so to bed. And Nancy Spain and Denis Norden, your quotation is, there is a happy land far, far away. And then at the end of the programme, I shall ask Frank and Denis to give me their ideas of how these words came to be said or written, and I don't want any of these answers now. Well, round 2 is the reason why department. 3 marks for a correct answer, though I may give some for originality if the accuracy is lacking. Dilys Powell, why, in the novel Lorna Doone, is there a feud between the Doone family and the hero John Ridd?
Otherwise there wouldn't be any plot.
So on those family things, somebody must have killed somebody.
Yes?
Wait a minute, now the hero... Jan Ridd was the hero.
Yes.
Jan Ridd was the hero. And he did for the lot in the end. Carver Doone went down in a swamp.
Yes. That's a lot later.
I think he must have the Doones must have done for his father.
That's absolutely right. The Doone family murdered John Ridd's father, as far as I remember, in the first chapter. Oh,
got rid of him.
They Doone him.
And so it went on throughout the book.
That's a thigh slapper.
A thew slapper.
All right, your turn, Denis Norden. Why did the tortoise win the race against the hare?
Why did the tortoise? Because it reached the finishing line before the hare did.
It did. Could you expand a bit?
I could. I remember the hare sat down on its scut somewhere in the middle of the race. Actually, it's very misleading, isn't it, this thing, because it's sort of slow and steady wins the race, providing that the strong and the swift give up halfway, not providing that they take part in the race, in which case you haven't a chance.
It's a case of habitude.
Habitude. Life is 6-4 against.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I've got the bit about the hare sitting down, but it goes a little further than that, I think, Denis.
Well, the tortoise went further.
Yes,
than
the
that,
tortoise
the hare
went further.
Yes. And the tortoise didn't sit down.
2 out of 3, because you've missed the one essential point, that the hare not only sat down, but fell asleep. Nancy Spain, we know that Rip Van Winkle walked off into the mountains and fell asleep. He also fell asleep and woke up 20 years later. But why did he walk off into the mountains in the first place?
Quarrelled.
With whom?
His wife.
Yes, absolutely right. 3 marks. She was a nagging shrew, and he couldn't stand it any longer, went off, and came back 20 years later. Moral there somewhere. Frank Muir, why did Caesar mistrust Cassius?
Ah, yes. Ah, well, you've got to be put into picture first, you see. You see, it opens with all these chaps, centre stage, slightly down stage L. And there's carpenters and shoemakers, and they all jolly around and say lines and go off. Ah. Then another lot of people come in, the soothsayer comes on and says, sooth. And then they go off. And then the conspirators, Decius and Cascara and Cassius and Brutus and others too humorous to mention, they mill about vaguely, bottom R, and then the Caesar enters. Caesar and his retinue enter. I can't remember the name of the retinue because they never give it.
No.
Probably villagers and others. And they advance downstage, and then Caesar says to his retinue, he says, give me about Let me have about me men that are fat, sleek-headed men, such as sleep nights. Yon Cassius hath a lean and hungry look. Yond Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous.
Absolutely right.
Well, I got there.
Well,
there's your answer.
That's most of the play also in a nutshell. Well done. 3 marks.
It's rather a large nut.
Well, the next round concerns verse and poetry. I give each member of each team a quotation and ask them to complete it. Give me the next line or two. 2 marks if they can complete the quotation, and 2 more for correctly naming its source. Dilys Powell, they stole little Bridget for 7 years long. When she came down again, her friends were all gone.
Little Bridget. It's a nursery rhyme, is it?
No, it's in the nursery.
Not a nursery
No.
rhyme. I've never heard it before.
It's by a chap called William Allingham, a poem called The Fairies, which begins up the airy mountain down the rushy glen. We don't go hunting for fair of little men. And about stanza 4 or 5, I think. They stole little Bridget for 7 years long. When she came down again, her friends were all gone. They took her lightly back between the night and the morrow. They thought that she was fast asleep, but she was dead with sorrow. Denis Norden, very different this. I intended an ode, and it turned to a sonnet. It began à la mode. I intended an ode.
Maud crossed the road in her Easter new bonnet. I intended an ode, but it turned to a sonnet.
It's as though I heard a voice
Coleridge all over again.
saying, but Maud crossed the road. Wait, I hear that voice again.
In her Easter new bonnet.
In her Easter new bonnet.
I intended an ode, but it turned to a sonnet.
I intended an ode, but it turned into a sonnet.
It's a famous triolet.
It's a
I'd
famous
like another
trio.
name rather than Maud, just to get it right.
Well, it can't be George.
Rose, I suppose. Rose.
Yes.
No, Rose.
Rose, that's it. Rose crossed the road. Do you know who wrote it?
Jack, I will be honest.
It's a
In
famous
the
writer
whole of
trio
my
lets.
life, I have never heard this. I think, no,
Oh,
really.
he's a famous old triolet.
He's a triolet writer,
Oh, well, yes, I'll give him
and there's
another
not much
mark
of a
for that.
living in that.
Oh, well,
is there?
he was the poet laureate, but I forgot.
Yes.
The poet laureate?
Poet laureate, yeah, you know.
Ah, Dobson.
Yes. You've fought your way through to full marks. You get 4 marks. It's Henry Austin Dobson, who was, as you say, poet laureate, a triolet, Rose Leaves, I think it's called, which is taken in different ways. And it runs, I intended an ode, and it turned to a sonnet. It began à la mode, I intended an ode, but Rose crossed the road in her latest new bonnet. I intended an ode, and it turned to a sonnet. Now, Nancy Spain. Bid me to live, and I will live, thy Protestant to be.
Well, Herrick,
Yes.
bid me die.
No, not yet.
Oh, all right then.
That comes later. 2 marks, I think. It is Robert Herrick, to Anthea who may command him anything. Bid me to live, and I will live, thy Protestant to be, or bid me love, and I will give a loving heart to thee. He goes on to die later on, but that's
I'm sure, yeah.
several bits
all
later.
All that hair.
Now, Frank Muir. Hark where my blossomed pear tree in the hedge leans to the field and scatters on the clover.
Oh, to be an April.
Oh, yes.
Yes, it is, yes.
Oh, to be in
Yes.
Browning, now that April's here. This is the wise thrush who sings his song
Yes.
Twice over.
twice over, in case you think he never could recapture or recapture that first fine careless rapture. It's quite an effort for a swallow to sing. It's Browning, Robert Browning.
Yes.
Home Thoughts from Abroad.
Well done. 4 marks. And it goes, just to get this quote right, hark where my blossomed pear tree in the hedge leans to the field and scatters on the clover blossoms and dewdrops at the bent spray's edge. That's the wise thrush. He sings each song twice over, lest you should think he never could recapture the first fine careless rapture. Home Thoughts from Abroad. Well, the next round is about origins and derivations, and it's always pretty hard to mark, but a maximum of 3 marks if I think they've deserved it. Dilys Powell, you begin. Penicillin.
Well, illin is a kind of scientific termination. Well, it's a kind of fungus.
Yes. I'll give you another mark if you say who discovered it.
Oh, Fleming.
Yes. Antibiotic, first discovered in mould, and the culture under the microscope looked like thousands of tiny microscopic little pencils. And that's the name for the mould, penicillium, and hence penicillin for the drug. Originally, they weren't pencils, they were little paintbrushes, because the Romans didn't have any pencils, but that perhaps doesn't matter. 2 out of 3. Denis Norden. Gout.
Gout is an illness. Its origin, I always thought, was port. Gout. What, the word? The origin?
Yes.
Well, French, actually.
Yes,
the French are saying that everybody has gout, or chacun a son, as they say, and that's what it comes from. It's a mistranslation.
You've got to add another T and E onto that, and it is French, so I'm helping you a bit.
G-O-U-T-T-E is a drop.
Yes.
In French. Everybody has a drop.
Lands on the big toe
port,
joint.
yes.
And the results go.
Well, I think again, 2 out of 3 for sheer ingenuity. A disease of the small joints, particularly of the big toe, which is very painful. It comes from the word meaning a drop in French, because in medieval medicine they thought it was caused by drops of acrid matter getting into the joints.
It is.
Nancy Spain. To go through the mill.
Means that you've had a terrible time
Mm-hmm.
and emerged better than the others. You get ground down to a pulp and you're better.
I don't know why you're better.
You're better? Well, aren't you?
Different.
Well, yes, transformed. Husks have gone one way, the millstones round your neck. What do you want me to say, Jack?
I think 2 out of 3 again. To suffer, either physically or metaphorically, grain going through the mill and being ground to powder or to flour, it's also a very old form of children's game if one of the children had been nasty to the other ones, where you had a row of children who leant up against a wall, making a kind of tunnel, and put the palms of their hands flat against the wall, and the wretched child had to run through 4 times, and he got 4 kinds of ill treatment. Rain first, which is a good slap, lightning the second time, which is a rabbit punch, a third time thunder, which is a prod with the knee, which sounds horrible, and the last time hailstones, which is a sharp punch in the back.
And there speaks the Director of Education for Darwin.
Oh, yes, we do it every day. All right, back to Frank Muir. A man with no scruples.
A man with no scruples is unprincipled.
Yes.
That's the meaning.
Yes.
That's me one. A scruple is a tiny, weeny little apothecary's measure.
Yes.
It's a little sort of brass leaf bent, and you have to pick it up with tweezers.
Absolutely right, yes. A man without moral principles, you're quite right about that, and you're right about the apothecary's weight, 20 grains, a very tiny
Well,
weight.
it's 2 out of 3, isn't it?
So, a scruple, metaphorically, was a slight hesitation or doubt as to whether what you were just about to do was moral or honest, but very tiny. A man with no scruples at all had none. And now we come to the last round and go back to the 2 quotations I gave the teams earlier in the programme. For 2 marks, Dilys Powell, I'd like the origin of your quotation, and so to bed.
Samuel Pepys.
Samuel Pepys's diary. It ends the chronicles of various days, well or ill spent. Nancy Spain, the origin of your quotation, which was, "There is a happy land far, far away."
It's a hymn
Yes?
by somebody called Andrew Young.
Well done. Well, now I shall ask Frank and Denis to give me their explanation of how these quotations came into being, and on this occasion the marks will go to whichever incredible explanation receives the larger or longer amount of applause from the audience here in the studio. So, back to Frank Muir and his quotation, "And so to bed."
And so to bed. "Oh, botheration!" exclaimed Anne Kennington, her pretty face puckering into a moue of vexation. She had come to the end of her book, her lovely book, The Conquest of Everest, She let it slip from her slim artistic fingers with a plonk onto the carpet. How she loved reading of Tibet. Tibet, where Daddy was. Anne got up and examined her face carefully in the old mirror. Below was a slim figure. She threw on an old pair of shoes, an old sweater, and made for the village. And she got to the clearing, and there by the old cottage, she pulled up with a jerk. There was Blair Tremaine. Anne, he breathed. She smiled at him, then she flitted past and into his cottage. As ever, the scene inside brought a catch to her throat. He lived alone, Blair. It was an ordinary, humble bachelor's, a poor dwelling. There was a gumboot full of porridge. There was the old-fashioned wooden mangle he used for getting the last of the toothpaste out of his tube. Suddenly she heard a noise, and there was Blair towering over her. He folded her in his arms twice. He had very long arms. And he hugged her to him, and her face was buried in the deep, spaniel-smelling tweed of his jacket. Anne, he gasped throatily. He was a man of few words. But those he knew, he worked hard. He said, Anne, I want you to marry me. I've always loved you, and I think you love me. And she rather thought she did. But a tinge of carmine mantled her ear, and she ran past him, ran out into the woods where there was freedom, and she had time to think. Suddenly there was a honk, a purr of powerful exhausts, and there was Roddy Fox Carfax in his fast red sports car. He was terribly good-looking. He switched off the ignition, spun the wheel negligently until the wheels were pointing straight ahead, and sat there for a moment, cleaning his nails with a folded £5 note. But he was somehow almost too good-looking. There was something almost feminine in his pink cheeks and his carefully combed hair. With a sudden gesture, he folded the £5 note, put it in his handbag, and put the handbag in the glove compartment of the car. He said, Anne, I want you to marry me. As you know, Father left me £1 million. I'm hoping to make it 2 million. You see, I'm going to Tibet tomorrow, Anne. I want you to come with me as my wife. I'm opening a holiday camp there, on a plateau. She said, I must have time, please, Roddy. And she ran away, and all that day she ran. It seemed to be sometimes she was in fields, one time she was in Grosvenor Crescent, Bognor Regis. But eventually, when night came, she found her way back to her cottage, and there were 2 bunches of flowers waiting for her, a bunch of crimson orchids. And it just said, please be mine, Roddy Fox Carfax. And then there were 3 little daisies, held together with fuse wire. And it said, be my love, Blair. Which was she to choose? When she woke up on her honeymoon, did she look out of the window? Did Anne look out of the window and see the palaces and the distant Himalayas of Tibet? And did she see the face of her millionaire husband? Or did she see a gumboot of porridge and the face of the man she really loved? I think we all know in our hearts what her choice was when she woke up and saw Tibet.
Now, after that heartless story, I'm going to turn to Denis Norden and remind you that his quotation was, there is a happy land far, far away.
I was musing in my flat the other day. I have a muse flat, actually. And I got to thinking, you know the way you do sometimes when the television's broken. There's nothing so pathetic as a fallen star. Now, this thought was occasioned by the fact that morning I'd had a new charlady. I'd had to get rid of the old char lady because of something that happened with Venetian blinds. I have had Venetian blinds in my front room, and she'd taken it into her head to clean them by putting them in the washing machine. I don't know if anybody would be interested in buying 9,713 toothpicks. But she had to go, and she went, and I sent to the local slave market for another char lady, and they sent this woman, Mrs. Haviland, who was a very nice, decent, responsible sort of person, rather different from the usual type of char lady. For one thing, she turned up wearing white elbow-length gloves and a pink chiffon evening dress with silver shoes. And I said to her, "You seem a very superior sort of person to be engaged in this menial chore." "Kindly," I said. And she looked up, and there was a tear in her eyes, and it was only then that I recognized whom she was none other than. Do you know who she was none other than? She was none other than Teresa Haviland, of Geoffrey and Teresa Haviland. 3 times winners of the South Middlesex Ballroom Dancing Championships. And she told me her story, which I found very affecting. You won't, because you don't look that sort of person, but I did. You remember Geoffrey and Teresa Haviland, Mr. and Mrs. Slow Foxtrot, King and Queen of the Ballroom, who had reigned undisputed champion 3 times, until suddenly the taste of the public changed. All the public wanted was Latin American dances, and Geoffrey couldn't do the cha-cha. He found himself in the same dilemma as some of the best minds of our time. Too old for the cha-cha and too young for old-time dancing. She had to descend to scrubbing in order to support them both. I was appalled. I said to her, "But can you do the cha-cha?" So she said, "Yes." I said, "Well, why don't you teach Geoffrey how to do it?" For the first time, a gleam of hope came into her eye. "Do you think I could?" I said, "Of course you could. Stick at it. You just cha-cha away with him. He'll learn it." Her face lit up. She said, "Yes, yes. Perhaps I could even make use of this menial experience I've had. I could describe myself as the cha-cha-cha." Well, I must admit I would like to make it a happy ending, but I have never heard of them since. But I would like to think that somewhere in some small room, Teresa is teaching Geoffrey, pounding away at the steps of the cha-cha while some little battered gramophone plays Tea for Two or Patricia. I just hope so, that's all. Wherever you are, Mrs. Haviland, keep at it. Teresa Haviland, cha-cha away.
Well, that was an affecting one that time. Your marking is very hard to distinguish. You gave about the same amount of applause to both. I think I should have to make that a tie between Frank Muir and Denis Norden. And that brings us to a final mark in which Dilys Powell and Frank Muir just win by 1 mark from Nancy Spain and Denis Norden. And it also brings to an end this edition of My Word.
In My Word, you heard Dilys Powell, Nancy Spain, Frank Muir and Denis Norden, introduced by Jack Longland. The program was devised by Tony Shryan and Edward J. Mason and presented by the BBC.